Well, good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and call to order this meeting of the Executive Committee. Clerk, please call the roll.
Good morning, everyone. If you could please make your selections on your tablet. Chair, we have a quorum with 4 members here and 3 members absent.
Thank you, Clerk. Let's move to non-agenda public comment. This provides 2 minutes for anyone who would like to provide comment on something that is not on today's agenda, but is within the purview of the Executive Committee. Clerk, do we have any non-agenda public comment?
We do. Alex Wong, if you can please make yourself to the podium.
I support the airport rail connection, but I am concerned with the airport trolley concept that MTS is supporting in conjunction with Sandag, which would merge onto existing green and blue line tracks on Hawthorne. Even with an extended trench, this would create a bottleneck that would limit green, blue line, and blue line capacity, frequency, and speed. This could permanently cap green and blue line frequencies to 10 minutes each. We cannot afford this. With University City, Mission Valley, and Grantsville set to add 130,000 new residents and over 72,000 new jobs, the green and mid-coast lines each need 7.5 minutes or better frequencies. Otherwise, trolley overcrowding and long wait times will lead residents and commuters to drive instead of take transit, increasing congestion, vehicle miles traveled, and emissions. Furthermore, frequency is first and foremost to transit riders because 1 minute waiting for the bus or train feels like 2 to 3 minutes spent on board a moving bus or train. That's why MTS should help Sandag ensure that the airport's rail connection will neither merge onto nor share tracks with the blue and green lines. This will free up existing trolley tracks, allowing MTS to maximize blue, green, and airport line frequencies.
That concludes public comments.
Thank you very much, Clerk. Let's go ahead and move to approval of the minutes of the December 12th, 2024 Executive Committee meeting, as well as the minutes of the August 7th, 2024 Budget Development Committee meeting. Clerk, do we have any public comment on those minutes?
We have no public comments.
Okay, seeing no public comment, do we have a motion to approve the minutes? We have a motion from Vice Chair Goebel, and we have a second from Director Elo Rivera. Any further discussion on the motion to approve the minutes of those 2 meetings? Seeing none, Clerk, please call the roll.
Please make your selection on your tablets. The motion passes with 5 members voting yes and 2 members being absent.
Thank you, Clerk. Let's move on to our discussion items. Item 4 is an informational report on the San Diego Transit Corporation pension investment status. Mike Thompson is with us along with Jeremy Miller of RVK. Please proceed whenever you're ready.
Good morning, Mike Thompson. I'm the Deputy CFO here at MTS. We have a couple of reports on the San Diego Transit Employees Pension Plan. This is a legacy plan that's been around for a long time, and it's the only pension plan that we actually self-manage for our new board members. We do have MTS employees and San Diego Trolley employees are on CalPERS plans. That's all managed by CalPERS, but this one we do manage, and it's for the bus side of the house. And with me is Jeremy Miller from RVK. He is our investment consultant on this plan.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy. I'm a senior consultant with RVK, and I'm going to be walking through your investment update for fiscal year 2024. On the first slide, we look at the broad investment structure as of 6/30/2024. At the top, you can see the broad asset classes that the portfolio is invested in and dollar amounts, the percentages, as well as the target. And one thing we like to remind right at the beginning is while we are focusing on the assets as the investment consultant, we want to make sure we work closely with the actuary to understand the liability structure and remember that the assets are there for a purpose. And so one of the first things we note there is while we are trying to maximize returns, we're trying to do so at a prudent level of risk that's appropriately aligned with the liability profile. So given that this is a mature plan, it's been closed for quite some time. The asset structure over time has also been reduced in risk, and you can see that that risk profile has been reduced fairly significantly over the last 10 plus years. Because of that liability structure and that liability profile, we feel like an asset structure that's more conservative and more liquid is appropriate because the assets, again, are there to satisfy the liabilities. So we have more of a capital preservation mentality with less focus on equities. And we've also tried to reduce fees in the process through the use of passive investing. On the next slide, we get into a little detail with the underlying managers and products and strategies that are used to implement that overall asset allocation. It's diversified across 9 different products. There are some changes you will note from last year, a little bit more in fixed income, a reduction in the alternative strategies, which help to lower fees and also take advantage of the higher interest rates that are available that are slowly getting closer and closer to that actuarial rate of return. So it helps to align risk and return. You'll note the direct investment in ESG per our previous conversations, as well as a desire as you look at some of those percentage allocations to try and reduce concentration risk within any one particular active strategy, though we do have higher allocations in passive, which are just trying to get broad exposure. That also helps to reduce fees. We've tried to have, again, broad product diversification as well. On the next slide, we get into performance. This is focusing on near-term fiscal year 2024. It was a strong year for equities with strong economic growth and monetary easing. Technology sector in particular doing well, which helped be a tailwind for equities. Bonds, on the other hand, while those higher yields are very welcome and are going to be very helpful going forward for your plan, a little bit difficult this year with as rates rise, bond prices go down. And so that helped to mitigate some of that income protection that you had on bonds. Still, was a good year for the plan, returned 8.4% for the fiscal year. That was well above your actuarial rate of return of 6%. And so it was a good year. On the next slide, we look at long run performance. When you look at near term or very long term, returns are good. When you look at those intermediate periods, things struggled a little bit and are below this actuarial rate of return. So you're going to have years where you're above, years where you're below. Generally, long run, we think you're structured to beat that actuarial rate of return. But 2022, which was a difficult year for all plans, with stocks and bonds going down at the same time, which we haven't seen for many decades, with the significant rise in inflation that hurt all pension plans and has brought those 5-year returns down. But long run, in summary, long run, we think you're diversified well. You've got an asset allocation that's aligned with your liability structure that will allow you to beat your actuarial rate of return while still having a higher emphasis on capital preservation. You've are invested in a number of products to help reduce fees, and it's positioned well going forward, including so far in fiscal year 2025, up about 3% through the end of this year, and probably up another 1% or 2% so far in calendar year 2025 as well. So did well last year, continues to do well going into this year, and we think positioned well going forward. And those, again, higher yields will be a nice tailwind for a more conservative portfolio going forward. So I'll stop there, see if there's any questions.
Thank you. Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
We have no public comments, Chair.
Okay, this is an informational item. No motion is necessary, but at this time, we'll see if we have any committee member discussion on the item. All right, seeing none, let's go ahead and move on to our next item. We, again, appreciate the presentation and the update on that. We'll move to item 5. That is the San Diego Transit Corporation Employee Retirement Plan's actuarial valuation as of July 1st, 2024. Mike Thompson remains with us, and he is joined with representatives from Chiron.
Okay, for our same employee pension plan here for Senior Transit, this is the actual results as of the end of last fiscal year, July 1, 2024. And the purpose of this is to set our contribution for the next fiscal year, FY 2026. So at the end of this, there will be a recommendation. I am joined by Ann Harper and Alice Alsberg to give this presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Alice and I are here, as Mike said, to give the actual update for the year, where we do determine what the contributions need to be for the next fiscal years to keep your pension plan on track to be fully funded. And we also look at the funded status of the plan. So with that, I will turn it over to Alice to walk through the first part of our presentation.
Thanks, Anne. All right, so with today's presentation, whenever we're bringing actuarial materials before the board, we like to start high level and start with a background of what the actuarial valuation is looking at and the calculations that are involved in that valuation. And then when we jump into the results, we focus on three questions. Where is the plan now? Where has the plan been historically? And where is the plan going in terms of the future outlook? So future outlook for funding, future outlook for stability in that funded ratio. So let's start with the big picture. This big picture, this pension tank, is a time-tested depiction of what the pension system looks like in balance. So when we perform an actuarial valuation every year, we calculate the actuarial liability. So the actuarial liability is the amount of benefits that are earned to date by all of the members, so the active members and those who are in pay status. So in this picture, the size of the tank is the actuarial liability. And when we look at that actuarial liability, we turn to Jeremy and RVK to understand what are the assets for the current year. So as of the fiscal year ending June 30, 2024, what were the assets in the plan? And if those assets in the plan are less than the actuarial liability, there's a difference in that funded level of the tank. So we see that there's an empty gap, the assets being the green, the size of the tank, the liabilities, the gap there between the green assets and the top of the tank is the unfunded actuarial liability. So in order to meet the benefits, so the benefit payment is the goal of every pension plan, is to be able to fund the benefits that are promised to the members. And for those benefits to be paid out, the assets need to be available to pay those benefits. And assets come into the system via investment returns. So RVK looks at the asset allocation, the strategy for meeting the needs of the plan in terms of the investment returns and that risk preference. And then there are contributions that come into the system. And the contributions come into the system by way of member contributions. So your older members, the legacy plan members, are paying 8% of their pay into the system. And then the new members under the PEPRA provisions are paying 9% currently. So there's the member contributions that are coming in as a percent of pay. And then there's the employer contribution. So what's MTS's contribution for the year to help fund these benefits to ensure that there's assets in the system to meet these future benefit payments? And that employer contribution is the key takeaway of the annual actuarial valuation. So how much money is MTS going to put in this coming year for those towards those benefits? So let's zoom in on the contributions. So the member contributions, as I stated, the members pay either 8% or 9% of pay. And the total contribution for the system is composed of three components. So there's normal cost. Normal cost is the accrued benefits that actives are earning in a given year. So your active population, there's roughly 300 actives remaining in this plan. And those 300 actives, every year that they work, they continue to earn benefits. So the normal cost is paid for in the annual contribution. Then there's an element for the unfunded actuarial liability. So that's the gap between the top of the tank and the assets. And in order to fund that shortfall, there are amortization payments that are set up each year, and those payments are paid off on a structured basis as a level dollar payments. So every year, so you'll see in this year's valuation, if there are gains or losses, then the new experience gets amortized and added towards payment towards that unfunded. And then there's the expected administrative expenses. And in this case, it's roughly $300,000 for the year to administer the plan. So the sum of those three components make up the total contributions that are necessary to go into the system to meet the funding of the plan. Let's see. Oh, there. Oh, no, I'm going too far. There we go. All right. So let's take a look at the numbers behind this pension scenario here. So in this slide, we're showing the contribution reconciliation from the prior fiscal year to the upcoming fiscal year. So the total contribution, so that was made up of the normal cost, the amortization payments, and the expected administrative expenses. The contribution for the current fiscal year, so in the year that we're in now, 2024, 2025, the contributions coming into the system are $20.175 million. Those contributions for the following year at the bottom there, based on the results of this valuation, will be $21.231 million. So that's a difference of $1.056 million for the year. And the components of change are broken down as follows. So first we have the actuarial investment experience. So for 2024, as RVK, as Jeremy stated, the plan did well. So the target return for the plan is 6%. So the plan uses a 6% discount rate. A 6% is the expected return for the year. So whenever the fund exceeds 6%, there's a gain to the system. So that gain is represented by a reduction to the contribution rate of $76,000. But actuarially, we don't use the market value of assets on an annual basis to fund the plan because market values fluctuate much more than pre-planning funding allows for. So an actuarial value of assets smooths the gains and losses that occur over the last 5 years in order to provide more stable funding. Well, in 2022, there were very unfavorable results in terms of the market value of assets. And those unfavorable results for over the course of 5 years, 20% a year, are phased in to the asset value so that it's not a hit all at once to those contributions. So the continued phase-in of the net deferred loss increases the contribution for the coming year by $568,000. So the aggregate or the net asset experience increases the contribution by $492,000. And when we came to you last year with the projections, those projections did show that this coming year's contribution would be higher because we knew that the reconciliation of those deferred losses would be coming. So this is showing that slight decrease because of the favorable returns for the last fiscal year 24, but then the increase to the contributions because of that net deferred loss. And then we move on to the next line, the actuarial liability experience. So the actuarial liability experience, the plan demographics, what happened to the membership, did the members behave, so to speak, according to all of the actuarial assumptions? And one of the strongest drivers of these actuarial assumptions is the salary, because the benefits are salary-based benefits. So the salaries for your members grew more than assumed. And when those salaries grow more than assumed, then the corresponding benefits are higher than assumed. And in this case, we're seeing a $611,000 increase to the contributions due to that liability experience. And then two smaller line items. The next one, reducing the benefits by 178,000. So that's for benefits earned by active members. Your active member population is shifting greatly from the old legacy benefit structure to the PEPRA benefit structure. And those PEPRA benefits offer a lower benefit accrual. And so as we move, the active membership shifts and grows in the percentage on the PEPRA side, that pulls down, decreases that total contribution because the normal cost component is decreasing. And then there are other miscellaneous factors that have to do with expenses different than expected, contribution timing adjustments that impact that contribution by 131,000. So again, to recap, in aggregate, the net change in contribution from the prior year to the coming fiscal year is an increase of about $1 million to the 21.2 million.
So Alice gave you the play-by-play from what happened from the last valuation to this valuation. I'm now going to do a little bit of historical background on the contributions. And you can see in 2023 and 2024, that was the reconciliation that Alice just went through, where the contributions went from 20.2 million to 21.2 million. However, if you look at this 10-year period back in 2015, you can see that the contribution was much lower at $12 million. And I'm just going to walk you through why there has been this increase in contributions over time. In 2016, the contribution went to $15.1 million and stayed relatively stable for the next 3 years. And the primary reason for that was the assumption change. We reduced the discount rate or the assumed rate of return for your plan from 7.5% to 7%. So remember those levers on the tank. If you have your investments and your employee contributions coming in, if you pull back on those investment earnings, meaning you're assuming there's going to be less coming into the tank through those earnings, investment earnings, then the only other way to compensate for that is the contributions would have to increase because of that. So that's why you're seeing that big bump in the contribution in 2016. And then you're also seeing that bump again in 2019 when it goes from 15.9 to 17.5 million. And that again was another reduction in the assumed rate of return or the discount rate. We had another assumed rate of return in 2021, which again increased those required contributions. And in the last 2 years after 2021 and 2022 and 2023, you're seeing that phase in of the returns in 2022, which was they were negative 11%. So we're phasing that experience from the assets over the next over 5 years. So we've got 3 years of that experience phased in at this point. Here we're showing the history of the funded ratio. So in 2024, the funded ratio was 57.2%, and it remained stable from last year at 57.2% as well. However, this funded ratio that we're showing is based on the actuarial value of assets. On the market value of assets, the funded ratio is a little bit lower at 55.5, but that ratio increased from last year due to the market value returns from 2024. So this graph is showing the funded ratio. As I said, the line is the funded ratio, and the bars represent both the assets and the liabilities. The gold bars represent what the value of the assets are, that actuarial value of asset, the smooth assets. And the bars represent the unfunded accrued liability portion. So in total, the total bars represent what your liabilities are. And you can see the colored pieces of the unfunded accrued liability are the chunks of liability that were added to the plan when we reduced that discount rate. And over the course of this 5-year period, it reduced from 7.5% all the way down to 6%. So a pretty drastic reduction over the last 10 years based on that risk profile that Jeremy had spoke of. So again, you can see there's a dip from 2015 to 16, a big reduction, and that's again due to the discount rate being reduced. And most of these changes are driven by that discount rate or asset experience. So this next slide here is just showing graphically in these pie charts the changes in your member composition over the last 10 years. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the head count in 2014, and then the liabilities below that, where the retirees made up about 50% of the head count, but about 61% of the liabilities. And the actives about 37 head count, 35% of the liabilities. And that shift in 2024, you see the head count has drastically increased for the retirees up to 70%, and only about 20% of the population is made up of your active membership. So that makes sense that when you look at the retiree liability in 2024, it makes up over 70% of the plan's liability. So as Jeremy was saying, a very, very mature plan since it is closed to most new entrants since 2011. So now we're looking at the plan going forward. Like, what does your funded policy and what does it look like in terms of how your plan is going to be funded on a forward-looking basis, which is really kind of the most important thing in this valuation, to make sure that you're on track to be fully funded at some point in time. And so what we're showing here is the projection of the funded ratio. The funded ratios are the numbers at the top of this graph. And these projections assume that each and every year your plan is going to earn that 6% assumed rate of return. And it also assumes that all the other assumptions that we have in place, like when the salaries members are getting, when they're retiring, when people actually die, that all is assuming that they're all going to be met. So this is kind of a perfect actuarial fantasy, if you will, but it does tell you something in terms of if all your assumptions are met, where your plan is going, right? So we do expect the liabilities to decrease over this period. And why is that? Because your plan is closed, right? Your liabilities are going to shrink over time. If it was an open plan, you would see those gray bars increasing over time, not decreasing. So we do know that that's going to happen. We don't know exactly what rate that's going to happen, but this is a pretty good idea of what your liabilities are going to look like going forward at 6% assumed rate of return. And so we do see some progress in that funded status over the next couple of years, and it's slower progress because we're still recognizing those deferred losses from 2022 and those assets. And so, but after that, we're assuming that, expecting that the funded ratios are going to increase by 3 to 4% each year until 2037. And that is when the most of the UIL is expected to be paid off. It's on every layer that we have is a closed layer, and we have 13 years to go on all of your amortization layers. So that is real. When I say this is an actual fantasy, it is real that those UAL payments are going to be paid if you continue making your contribution. That is not something that's not going to happen. It's just going forward, the smaller layers going forward, we don't know exactly what those are going to look like. But your plan is still on track to be 100% funded over the next 13 years. Here we show the projections of the total contributions over the next 20 years. And what we're seeing here is that bump up this year from 2025 to 26 fiscal year ending to 21.2 million. We do expect the contribution to increase slightly next year and then increase to 21.8 as of fiscal year in 2028, and that's due to, again, that phase in of those losses, asset losses in 2022. And then after that, we are projecting that the contribution is going to come down. And again, not in the next 2 years after 2028, that's mostly because we have had great experience in the last 2 years. So we're going to see the contribution rate come down, or contribution dollars come down. And then slowly we're going to see the contributions come down just because you're more and more actives are retiring or leaving the system. And as more and more actives leave, your normal costs, that cost of accruing benefits is going down. So you're going to see that slight decline over the course of the projection period here. And then the dramatic drop off in 2039 is when the bulk of your unfunded is going to be paid, and the contributions are projected to go from 13.7 to about 1.2 million. And that 1.2 million is only that normal cost rate plus expenses of the actives that you have in the system at that time. So one last takeaway here is I was talking about these actuarial fantasies, right? About everything is going to go just as assumed. Well, this slide shows you more of a range of what those contribution rates can look like and will look like based on actual returns in the market. So this is a stochastic projection where we take thousands of simulations over a 15-year period, and we rank them and stack them. And that black line represents the median of all of those scenarios and what your contribution will look like. And it's very, very similar to the projections I just showed you in the previous slide. But the bars, the colored bars, show you those ranges of possibilities where your contribution could fall depending on the return scenarios. And it's pretty obvious to note that in 2038, there's a huge range there. And that's the year before the final payment for your UAL. And the reason it spikes like that is every gain or loss in your system from now until then is amortized over a set period, meaning they're all amortized to be paid off in 2039. So if you have a huge loss the year before that, the funding policy right now is to pay that off immediately. So we have talked with Larry and Mike about looking into maybe changes in the funding policy when it gets closer and closer to that time so that your contributions aren't so volatile. But it's still far enough away that it's just something to be aware of, but also not to be alarmed by. So with that, oh, yeah.
So with that, we'll do the staff recommendation, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions. So the staff recommendation is that the executive committee receive the SDTC employment retirement plans actual evaluation as of July 1, 2024, which was attachment A, and forward a recommendation to the MTS board to adopt the pension contribution amount of $21,231,465 for the fiscal year 2026.
Thank you. Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
We do. If we could please have Casey Gupta come to the podium.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm a high school student. I was at the board meeting last month, and we're talking about cutting bus service here. Later today, we're talking about cutting bus service, and the S&P 500 since 2020 had a return of 98.55%, which is 15% a year. And during that same time, you guys faced losses of almost more than $500,000. That's $500,000 in the pocket of bus riders. Bus riders are hurting every single day. ICE was at the San Ysidro Transit Center. Bus riders are hurting, transit riders are hurting, and you're failing transit riders by projecting these massive losses. $20 million this year are $20 million of bus service that will have to be cut to pay for this. At some point, we need to look at how the money is being spent and how these massive amounts that MTS has to come up with are coming from. Thank you.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
All right, thank you. We will now open committee member discussion on this item. This is an action item, and we will begin our conversation with Director Ela Rivera. Let me see here. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation and the work on this. I know we've started to have some conversations here among some of the board members about interest in reopening the system. Just trying to understand the projections that we saw today. To what extent would reopening the system? So I know that there's risk involved as well, but in terms of providing more certainty down the road, in terms of contributions. Are there any benefits to the agency, potential benefits on that front?
In terms of opening the plan again?
Well, opening the plan in such a way that would provide, have more folks contributing in the future. Because there are impacts to having fewer folks contribute, correct?
Right.
So are there impacts to having more folks contribute?
Well, right now, having more folks contribute, they would be only contributing to their benefits that would be accruing, because right now the system is actually paying a dollar amount in terms of, when I say the system, the employers are paying a dollar amount to cover that unfunded accrued liability. So that dollar amount that they're paying wouldn't change at all. What you're talking about a lot of times, if you have a percentage of pay plan where you're contributing on like 15% of pay, then yes, then there would be more money coming into the system because the payroll would be greater for those members and you'd be paying more towards the UAL. But it's set up this way now to do a dollar amount to pay for that unfunded because it is a closed plan. So those members coming into the plan would only be paying for their own benefit, if you will, that normal cost rate.
So I think what he would like to know is what's the delta between what the members all now have, the active employees all now have the pension, and it's this pension, and they go into the pension and they start paying the percentage that they are required to pay into the plan. So they pay currently 9% of their wages into the plan if they are in the plan.
Right.
Is there a delta? Will the agency then have to pay less into the plan because they're paying more into the plan?
No.
And I wouldn't, thank you. Like not necessarily less, but then I think it's the next slide. So as we get, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, and there's just like a coincidental correlation here, but as the contributions drop, it seems like we've got some risk that increases as well.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand why increasing contributions over time wouldn't reduce that risk. I understand I think I understand what you're saying, but.
Okay. So increasing the contributions over time.
I know, I get it. Like at some point in time, theoretically, if it closes and like a bill becomes due and then people stop paying, like you get to that point, you get that, right? But if continuously you've got folks in the system and they continue to feed the system, do we reduce the likelihood that we end up in a situation like what I'm seeing in 2037, 2038, where.
Okay, so the situation in 2037 and 2038 is only due to the funding policy that's in place right now. Okay, so your funding policy is that every gain or loss going forward is going to be paid over a period such that it's fully paid by 2039. So no matter what happens between now and then, it's going to be paid for in 2039. Now, there are things that the board can do to level out that bump there, if you will.
Yep.
Because let's say something like 2022 happened in 2038, you would have to pay for that right now immediately in the next year. So that's why there's that huge bump there. And so looking at different funding policies to mitigate that and to level that out is something that a lot of closed plans will do so that they're not having these the volatility in the contributions. And the reason that it was set that way back, in 2012 is so that there was an end date to when this pension plan would be fully funded, but you are still getting that risk based on the way the funding policy is set up. So more contributions coming into the plan would not change that blip at all, because that's based on current assets. And the current, you have like $200 million in assets, right? And the contributions coming into this plan were 20 million last year. So the size of those assets compared to the contributions coming in are so much larger, right? What really matters right now for your system is the bulk of those assets in the system right now. Don't get me wrong, contributions coming in definitely help, but new member contributions, they're only going to be going towards paying for their benefits, if you will. And what that actually ends up doing is further, it does make the plan more risky because the more benefits and the more assets and everything you have, it just by nature makes it more risky. And that's not a bad thing. It's just what happens to a mature plan over time.
And are there policy choices to be made or that can be made to change that dynamic, obviously to reduce risk, but where the contributions are not, the contributions have a greater benefit to the system as a whole, rather than just the members in that exact pool of folks who are contributing?
I think this is actually something that we're going to have to, in our insourcing studying, we're going to have to understand the impacts to the plan.
Okay.
And I know actuaries don't like to conjecture on the spot. So I think we could probably, but as you can tell, like, for instance, we have to figure out, so if all of a sudden we add 500 new members into the plan, like today, we have 500 new people contributing 9%. Those folks will retire when they retire, and then they will have to do a whole actuarial study to figure out what that would do to the plan. Chances are most of those people who get that pension will then not be contributing enough to offset the cost to the $200 million investment that we already have. So that would mean in the early years, chances are we would have to increase our actuarial. See, I don't mind conjecturing because I'm not an actuary, but I mean, these are the things that we need to study in the insourcing study that we're working on, because that really has a dynamic effect on this plan.
Yeah.
Well, and when you say the contributions for the new members, if there were new members coming into the plan, then they pay for only half of their benefit. The employer pays for the other half. So it's a 50-50 cost share based on not new, but the current legislation in California called PEPRA back in 2013 when it was instituted, to make that a 50-50 cost sharing. So the members would be paying, but not their whole benefit, just half their benefit. And so the agency would be paying for that other half as well.
So, and then I'd like to add to that, in addition, the current funding policy uses a method to pay off the debt by that fixed date. If the plan were open, we, the actuaries, would come to you and say, for an open plan, the methodology would be different. There would be a longer time frame to pay off the annual experience that occurs. So we wouldn't be limiting it to 13 years. So for example, many of the plans in California use 15 years for their annual experience gains and losses. But because this plan is set to that target date of full funding, that period is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So it's crunching the contribution higher and higher. But an open plan would have a different dynamic, so they would have a different payment pattern.
That was the part I was trying to thank you. That was the part I was trying to get to in the follow-up question. Thank you. Appreciate that, Sharon. I did just want to make one last comment. Yes, this is a cost. The system does not exist without drivers. Riders don't get rides without drivers. So these are payments that were promised to the drivers of yesterday and today, and we need to keep that in mind. So the days of blaming public employees for receiving the payments that they were promised, which oftentimes meant lower pay in comparison to the private sector. I'm committed to us getting away from that. I think it was very detrimental to public employment in San Diego and across the country. And I just want to put that in perspective, because it can be easy to see this number in a vacuum. I think that's $20 million that could go to increasing services. Those services don't exist without drivers. I just wanted to make sure that we're all clear about that part. And with that, I'll make a motion to approve the recommendation, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Elo Rivera. Vice Chair Goebel.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Elo Rivera, I hope nobody blames the employees. They just were smart to join a system that was a good system. So there's no blame for somebody to making a good choice on what job they want to take. I hope nobody blames employees for that. Let's go back to slide 10 for a second to confirm the reason why it's such a spike in the last couple of years is just in case you have no 5 years left to smooth it out, you have to absorb it all in 1 year, essentially. Okay, that's fine.
Well, it's more, you're still smoothing out your assets, but it's how, when you have a loss or a gain, the period that you're paying for it is
Yes.
1 or 2 years when you get down to that date.
Yeah,
Yes.
you don't have a long time to
Right.
smooth
Right.
this out and recover it because you're done in
Right.
such and such. Let's go back to slide 3. My comments here are in point of view of we're always looking for money to lower our deficit. And I'm getting a sense there's not going to be significant dollars here once this plan is done in 12, 14 years. We're not going to be saving $20 million a year in contributions because of the 20 million. I don't really know what portion is the UAL. I don't know.
I can tell you the breakout. So the UAL for this year is about 17 million. The UAL payment out of the 21.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
But as we get towards the end of the plan, it's going to be a lot less, obviously.
That's correct.
Okay,
That's
so
correct.
you know, 15 years from now, we don't have a $17 million payment, but things will be different because we might have different benefits or something. I guess what my point is, going forward the future, this isn't going to be the source of saving some of our deficit. It is what it is. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, because you also have to realize that we do have a defined contribution plan as well that we fund for the drivers who are not in this plan. So that's a different.
And every time the discount rate gets lowered, that says if you exceed that discount rate, do we have a choice to keep it in the plan or is it mandated to stay in the plan?
It's mandated to stay in the plan.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
can't even use gains over market for an operating person, but it has to stay in the plan
Yes. Yeah.
smartly to
Right.
not borrow against the future for an obligation
Mhm.
that you have today. Thank you, Chair. I'll be glad to second the motion.
Thank you, Vice Chair Goebel. Any further discussion on this item? All right, seeing none, just one quick question for me. Our 6% discount rate, how does that compare to other agencies? I know that's something that we've typically.
You
talked about.
are one of, I think, the lowest in California, except for another closed plan up in Oakland. Oakland Police and Fire Plan has a discount rate of 5%, but it's low because of your risk profile. Right? Like you're very, very heavily invested in fixed income, which is appropriate for a closed plan. So most plans in California are around 6.75%.
Okay, thank you. All right, seeing no further comment on this item, we have a motion from Director Ela Rivera and a second from Vice Chair Goebel. Clerk, please call the roll.
Please make your selection on your tablets. The motion passes with 6 members voting yes and 1 member absent.
All right, thank you. Thank you again for the presentation and for answering the questions of the
Thank you.
committee here.
And thank you for the questions.
You bet. Okay, item number 6 is on a comprehensive financial analysis and a potential ballot measure. Let's invite Brent Boyd to lead this presentation. Feel free to get settled in and begin your presentation whenever you're ready.
If I could start, at last month's board meeting, we all presented to you our fiscal future as it stands right now. It's a snapshot in time. Steps can be taken, and we know that there's a lot of different moving parts on how we're going to address the potential fiscal cliff coming up. These 2 agenda items are intended to kind of pair together to gain some insights from all of you as to how you feel the board should be progressing as we move forward. And again, there's a lot of different moving parts, whether the state comes forward with some funding, whether we do a ballot measure. We want to be ready to address the fiscal cliff, whether there's new funding sources or not. And so what Brent's going to present to you today is a proposal for a comprehensive operations analysis, which is something we've done every 10 years for the last 20 years. So it is something that we would want to do anyway. It basically looks at our entire service area, looks at the services we're providing, which ones should we look at. But in this, we are also going to be looking at two scenarios that we would either not get any more money, have no new revenue sources, and what will we need to do to address fiscal cliff. And always cutting service has to be part of that. Raising fares could be part of that. You know, there's a number of different things we could do. And then on top of that is, what if we did get new sources of funding? What if we were to get a doubling of the TDA? What if we were to get a ballot measure? What would we want to add in the service areas? So that's what Brent's going to present to you. This is not to say, oh, definitely, you know, spend the money and do this, because we will have to come back to the board for a contract approval. So this is not the decision point where you say, oh, we're definitely going to do the comprehensive operations analysis and spend that money now. So we do have to do the procurement, but what we wanted to do was kind of lay out for you what that looks like and gain your insights as to whether or not the scenarios are the appropriate scenarios to look at. And then finally, at the very end, we'll talk about ballot measure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, board or executive committee. Brent Boyd, Director of Planning and Scheduling. As Sharon mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about a upcoming proposed COA, Comprehensive Operational Analysis, and a potential ballot measure. So what is a COA, Comprehensive Operational Analysis? Sharon touched on it. It's really a fresh look at looking at the transit system. What's working, what isn't, what can be improved, and so on. And this is a tool that many transit agencies use. As Sharon mentioned, we've used it a couple times over the last couple decades, and we'll have some details about that in a couple slides. Generally, we'll look at current and potential ridership, travel patterns, demographics, current and future land use, operating costs, how much does it cost to operate each of these services, and performance in relation to Board Policy 42, and that's specific to MTS. Board Policy 42 is what the board policy that governs our evaluation and implementation of transit services. It really guides the way that we view the routes. We have a number of different stats that we look at. And then once we review the stats, how are we going to change the services? And if we decide to change the services, it guides our implementation of those services. So the COA will follow along with that board policy. The recent COAs that we've done, 2006, this was pretty soon after the various operating entities got combined into a single operating entity of MTS. We had municipal operators, county transit services, the trolley, they're all separate agencies. They all got consolidated into MTS in the early 2000s. And we did a comprehensive look at the service. And we basically established a core network of high frequency services through route consolidation and straightening. You see here, we really focused on our high ridership, high frequency routes and really invested into those. Ultimately, about 75% of the routes got affected in one way or another. We had immediate ridership gains. See, we've had about 7% ridership year to year. However, pretty soon after we implemented the changes, we hit the Great Recession. So that really cut back on some of the improvements that we made. Significant cut of weekend services that you see there. And then also we cut back some of the frequency enhancements that we had made otherwise. But then after the COA, there were still, even though we had the Great Recession, we had a lot of investments in transit infrastructure in the region. We realigned the trolley services. We brought the Green Line to downtown. It used to terminate at Old Town. We extended it to 12th Imperial. We also brought low floor trolley cars to the entire system. We had Superloop, which was kind of the first rapid line that we established. That's the 201, 202 up in UTC and UC San Diego. And now when UCSD is in session, that's our highest ridership route. So it's been a great investment in the region. Then the I-15 rapid routes, we have the 280 and 290, which are express buses from Escondido, Rancho Bernardo, Sabre Springs, straight into downtown San Diego. And then the 235, which is also from North County to downtown San Diego, but stops at all the intermediary stations along the I-15. with the direct access ramps and so on, and takes advantage of the Centerline stations, Elkhorn Boulevard and University. And speaking of the Centerline stations, we also had the Mid-City Rapid, which is the 215, and that connects from downtown San Diego up to San Diego State, serving one of those stations. So a lot of investment in transit after the COA. So that led us to the Transit Optimization Plan in 2017, and that's really just another name for a COA. We had a different name for it. But in the same manner, we added service to the high frequency routes, the highly used high frequency routes. Ultimately, we affect about 60% of the bus routes, and it provided a basis for the Elevate 2020 ballot measure, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and we may revamp going forward. But again, we were impacted by something out of MTS's control before we had the Great Recession. And now right after implementation of the top, we had the COVID pandemic of 2020. So it really impacted the service enhancements that we had implemented. So major changes after the top, we had the COVID reductions. Of course, we've had operator shortages. But then we've also had a lot of transit investment. Again, we had the Midcoast extension, which is the blue line extended up to UTC, which has transformed transit in that area. And we had the copper line changes at the end of last year, adjusting services out in East County. We also had additional rapids down in South Bay, Otay Mesa, the 225, and Iris Rapid 227. So some significant investments. There's also a big focus on electric buses, which we'll talk about in the next presentation. And then we've had the COVID recovery with the SB 125 funds and so on. So there's been a lot of changes since the top in 2017. So why now do we want to do another COA? Well, we're through the major impacts of COVID. We're almost back to pre-COVID ridership. And there's been a lot of changes in the region that I just talked about, the blue line and rapid buses and so on. And of course, we've had changing demographics and travel patterns over the last decade or so. And primarily budget concerns, which we'll talk a lot about in the next presentation. So we really need to take a fresh look at the system. So the goals of the COA, if we were to do it, would be develop strategies to address current travel demand with projected funding levels, again, the budget issues, integration with the rest of our region's multimodal transportation system, realign existing services and frequencies and span of services to adopt to a new service strategy, which will be developed through the COA, then develop phasing plans and financial programs to support implementation of the service plans. And we'll have a couple different service plans, which Sharon touched on, and we'll get into detail on the next slide. And critically, we'll ensure that community input is considered throughout the entire study. So the different planning scenarios that we have identified for the COA is one where we've identified additional funding somewhere, whether it be a ballot measure or some other funding. And we have a ballpark estimate of about $75 million that we would be able to use to invest in our current transit system, to improve the current transit system, frequency, spans, and so on. If we did a ballot measure, we would most likely generate much more than 75 million, but we've targeted that as the specific amount to improve the existing services. And that could be refined as we go forward in the process. Scenario two would be no additional funding, no ballot measure or any other funding coming our way. We're projecting a budget shortfall of about 109 million in FY28. And that will need to be bridged somehow. There'll probably be a combination of efforts to bridge that gap, but there'll almost certainly need to be some level of service cuts. So right now we're eyeballing about $30 to $50 million in service cuts. And that's just again, a ballpark figure that we're using for now. So what does $30 to $50 million mean? It probably doesn't mean much in general to the general public and to us. What does it mean? You have a number of different buckets here. None of these are serious proposals. We would never propose to cut the entire trolley system, for instance, but we really just wanted to give everybody an idea of what we're looking at, the scale of the problem, scope of the problem. $30 to $50 million in service cuts could be all weekend bus and trolley service, so no service on Saturdays or Sundays. Complete elimination of the 15 worst performing bus routes based on subsidies per passenger. Could result in complete elimination of service in certain areas of the region. Another possibility is a 1/3 cut across the board to all bus services. So you think of every 3 buses that you see out there running, one of them would not be running And again, the complete elimination of trolley service. The trolley service estimation, it's a little bit strange with the calculation, but it's essentially all the capital would remain out there. But if we just stopped running the blue line, the orange line, and the green line, the copper line, we'd save about $46 million. So again, none of these are anything that we would most likely recommend, but we just wanted to give the scope of the problem that we're facing. So in terms of the management of the project, it'd be managed by the MTS Planning and Scheduling Department. But we'd hire a contractor to analyze existing conditions and work with MTS staff in developing the planning scenarios that we talked about before. We would be working hand in hand. We wouldn't just simply hand this project off to a consultant and let them run with it. We would be working hand in hand with them. And the MTS Marketing Communications Department will guide the outreach efforts throughout the project. In terms of specific tasks, we've broken down to 5 different tasks. One is data collection and review of existing conditions, and this is reviewing current plans, just generating all the data that we collect, APC data, passenger count data, demographics, all that kind of stuff. Then taking that information and evaluating our system. And we wouldn't simply evaluate it on a route by route basis. We look at segment by segment, time of day, day of week, all kinds of different scenarios. Then we'd evaluate the recommendations coming out of the Elevate 2020 effort. Again, there was a significant level of transit improvements recommended in that effort, and we'll go through them, including increased frequencies, expanded rapid bus service, and so on. But that was from 6 or 7 years ago. We want to evaluate if those still stand the test of time. And then after all that, we developed 2 different service and implementation plans, one for the increased level of service and one for a service reduction plan. The COA timeline, we are in February right now. If we go forward, the RFP will be posted towards the end of this month. And ultimately, we'd come back to the board of directors in May for final approval of a contract and to proceed with the project. Then we'd be collecting all the data, analyzing the data, and reviewing the Elevate 2020 recommendations throughout the spring and early fall. And that would lead us to developing the service enhancement plan in the event that we come up with new funding. And we'll be developing that plan through the end of this year into early 2026, where we'll have some key critical deadlines to determine if we're going to have that funding or not. While we're determining if we're going to have that funding or not, we will go with the last task, and that's developing a service reduction plan. And that'll take place over most of 2026 with the key deadline of November. That'll be the key deadline to determine if we're going to enhance service or have to reduce service. You see the outreach schedule to the right. Again, the marketing department will be leading that effort, and we'll have significant outreach throughout this effort. That could ultimately lead to a potential ballot measure. Again, we did a similar effort leading up to 2020. We had extensive efforts leading up to a potential measure. We had feedback from the board of directors, community advisory committee, working groups. We had a significant number of outreach events at transit centers and with community forums. We had a vision builder, which was a tool that the community was able to look at, determine trade-offs. If they wanted certain benefits, but they came with costs. So what are the priorities in terms of the projects? With polling data, focus groups, collaborated with SANDAG and all the other jurisdictions. And we had customer service comments. One thing I kind of skipped over is this was a ballot measure for the MTS service area only. It's not for the entire county, just for our service area. That effort resulted in a mix of recommendations, including improved frequencies and spans on all trolley lines, improved trolley infrastructure, the establishment of 21 rapid bus routes. And those were different levels of rapid buses. Some were just less frequent stopping, better branding, that type of thing. Others had more infrastructure investment. So there was a range of recommendations coming from the rapid services. First and last mile connections, bus route frequency and span improvements, mobility on demand services, capital improvements, and trolley planning studies. The measure had been polling very well. It needed a 2/3 approval. It had been polling well. But then we had COVID. We had to make a decision basically in spring of 2020. COVID struck in spring of 2020, and the decision was made to not go forward with the ballot measure. So now we are talking about it again, as Sharon mentioned, consideration of pursuing a sales tax measure in the 2026 general election, which would be November. Again, it would be the MTS service area only or parts thereof. Right now, it would require a 2/3 approval from the service area. Although the California Transit Association is pursuing legislation to drop the requirement to 55%. I think Sharon can talk much more about that. The half-cent sales tax, a ballpark estimate would generate about $300 million annually. And again, that $300 million would be used for a bunch of different buckets. And we're right now anticipating about $75 million for service enhancements to the existing network. This effort would require similar efforts to the Elevate 2020 effort, which includes significant outreach, economic analyses, polling data, and a development of the draft expenditure plan, which again, we'd have to develop in time for any decision that the board would make regarding a ballot measure. And that decision would have to be made by May of 2026 at the latest. So the staff recommendations are to have the executive committee recommend to the board of directors to pursue a COA to be completed by November 2026, and also begin preliminary efforts on researching the feasibility of placing a transit sales tax measure on the ballot for the MTS service area only.
So I would suggest that you could look at each of these separately, or you could look at them together. The second bullet point has a cost associated with it. So that's why we wanted to kind of get this committee's thoughts about that, because I wouldn't want to start spending money on something if this committee felt like the board would not want to go there. But I also think that a comprehensive operations analysis, again, we've done this every 10 years. I do think it's worthwhile whether you go for a ballot initiative or not. And especially if we have to bridge our fiscal cliff, our fiscal gap through service reductions. We want to have a very reasonable approach to any kind of service reduction. The totals that we would put into the RFP for the consultant to consider are flexible. We could certainly say bridge the whole gap with nothing but a service reduction. That is on a $420 million operating budget. $120 million would be very challenging to our customers if we tried to bridge it only with the service reduction. So with that, I will be opening it up to the chair.
Thank you. Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
Yes, we do. We have several. Alex Wong, can you please make yourself to the podium?
Would be risky for MTS to pursue its own ballot measure. I voted yes on Measure G and would vote yes again on any pro-transit measure. But will 2/3 of voters vote on MTS's ballot measure? Because if MTS pursues a ballot measure, it will require a 2/3 majority to pass. Even if we limit the MTS measure strictly to the MTS service area, 2/3 is an extremely high threshold to reach. After all, even if we excluded voters from more suburban areas and only counted voters within San Diego city limits, we saw that only 54% of voters supported Measure G. However, I saw that there was a proposal to lower that threshold to 55%, and I believe that that could make MTS ballot measure much more viable. So I think that we should continue pursuing it. However, I think it might be far better to leave proposing a pro-transit measure up to the citizens such that only a 50+1 majority is required to pass. Let's call it Measure G 2.0. But unlike the original Measure G, which only allocated 12% to transit operations, maybe Measure G 2.0 could allocate something like 40% to transit operations. We just need to communicate to citizens that MTS is in a fiscal crisis and that improving transit operations is far more urgent than building shiny new mega projects, because what's better than funding a purple line that might open in 30 years is funding to double frequencies on existing mid-coast and green lines and maybe on several of the busiest bus lines, which could happen in a year or so.
Casey Gupta, please make yourself to the podium.
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm back again. I'm here today because you're faced with a massive choice, one that'll define the future of public transit in San Diego. Right now, we're talking about slashing essential service, possibly cutting weekend trolley service entirely. That's not a solution. It's not fiscal responsibility. It's a fear-driven, short-sighted tactic that will devastate riders, hurt the economy, and push San Diego backwards when we should be moving forward. I'm not speaking to you as an elected official, as a consultant, but just a high school student, one that rides transit every single day. And let me tell you, people like me, people who depend on these buses and trolleys are frustrated. The elections are coming up, people are watching, and the best response that you can offer to this crisis is to gut transit service. You're failing San Diego. Instead of making cuts that punish transit riders, we need real solutions. That's why I'm calling for an independent third-party audit of MTS operations. I know audits are done every year, but let's be honest, these audits haven't fixed any real problems. In just a few hours of research comparing MTS operations to the National Transit Database, I identified over $80 million of potential savings, money that can be redirected to protect and even improve public transit service without cutting a single bus route. If I, as a student, can find these savings, imagine what a full-scale independent audit could uncover. To every board member in this room, this is your moment. You can either double down on a failing strategy or demand transparency and efficiency. You have the power to prevent service cuts, protect riders, and put MTS on the path to sustainable growth. We're talking about a ballot measure here. During Measure G, on election day, I knocked on over 600 doors. I came home exhausted. I care about transit, but what our constituents are saying that MTS is failing our transit riders. We need to deliver efficiency to the transit riders that depend on public transit service every single day. And it's possible without cutting a single bus route. San Diego can be the next West.
Your time has expired. Carolina Martinez, please make yourself to the podium.
Good morning. My name is Carolina Martinez with the Environmental Health Coalition and the San Diego Transportation Equity Working Group. I'm highly surprised and pleasantly surprised that MTS is considering the ballot measure. AB 805 was approved and worked on by many of us for this purpose. So we're here to support the COA. We want to know how the community is going to be involved in the COA. I think it's very important to ensure that we're engaged in it as we look at the analysis. And we're also here to support a ballot measure for 2026. As you know, we worked very closely. We've been working on this for years. We worked on LBA 2020. So we need to build on the momentum. There's a lot of work that was done, and it's only natural for us to continue to do that work and assume the risk. And I'm also here to ask that the analysis includes a close look at measures that were passed this last election in the country so that we could see what took for those regions to pass a measure. And that we also accelerate the timeline. For LBA 2020, we knew we were going to do a measure by December 2018. So our communities need more time. May 2026 is fairly short. So we ask that you accelerate the approval of considering this to be done by MTS so that it gives us time to actually pass it. And then, let's see, I think that's all I have in my notes. So we ask that you support this, that you do your due diligence and analyzing and assessing all the possibilities to increase its passage. That's it. Thank you.
And Sergio Estrada, please make yourself to the podium.
Good morning, Executive Committee. My name is Sergio J. Estrada. I am the Political Director for the San Diego Building and Construction Trades Council. Here today to listen on discussion and to convey our intrigue and our general support for a ballot measure. We need to do more to fund the services that our communities desperately need and also build out our system. The problems that we heard in this staff report are problems that we've experienced time and time again. Specifically, it seems every time after we do one of these studies, something something happens in the world and we're left scrambling. So, knowing that these things continually happen, we need to, as was mentioned, move ahead and really invest in these. Our communities desperately need them. I live in Chula Vista. I represent and work with folks that live in National City all across the Blue Line. We cannot be cutting services. We need to be investing in these services. We need to be investing in getting people, working people where they need to go efficiently, on time, and supporting the workers that get those people where they need to go. Thanks.
Carol Kim, please make your way to the podium.
Good morning, board members. It's good to see all of you. My name is Carol Kim. I'm the business manager for the San Diego County Building and Construction Trades Council, representing over 35,000 union construction workers in the region. Here, as AJ just spoke to, with real interest in a ballot measure to address some of the shortfalls that our structural budget deficit is leading to. We've got, as you know, we are worker advocates, so working people really do need transit. We need more transit, not less, and we want to help and support this agency in attaining that. Also, as we're seeing development happening across the region, especially in the South Bay, where we're looking at things happening in Chula Vista, big projects going up along the bayfront, et cetera, we're going to see real impacts on the ability of just in those communities in terms of traffic, et cetera. And so we want to make sure that there are opportunities for us to actually do infrastructure improvements in those places to ensure that our service frequencies don't get cut, that perhaps they can get expanded. And we actually do still want to see that purple line, hopefully before 30 years. So all those things are things that we want to be supportive of. We'd like to be part of those conversations, and we hope to work hand in hand with you in trying to get this done for 2026. Thank you.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
Thank you, Clerk. Thank you to all of the public commenters. We will begin our board conversation now with Director Elo Rivera.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I didn't realize going first on this one. Thanks for the report here. I'm just going to. I think there'll be a lot of focus on the impacts of what some of the potential service interruptions would be, and I'll kind of leave that to my colleagues. But I do want to lift up is one, who should be involved in the conversation. And I know Sharon, y'all did a great job last time of making sure that it was a broad coalition of folks, stakeholders in our system, including labor, community-based organizations, et cetera. I don't anticipate that'd be any different this time.
We do have a slightly shorter timeline, so we'll probably have to be very targeted in a lot of the outreach, but we will definitely have that coalition. The good thing is we never let that coalition fall apart. We've maintained that through the pandemic, and we want to continue to build upon that. But yes, we will be as rapid but in force with our public participation.
Good, because it won't work without their buy-in, and like both politically and in practice. Even if it were to pass somehow, it won't deliver what the community needs to deliver if the right folks aren't at the table. And the second thing that I wanted to lift up, I don't think we should be solely focused on the sales tax. I understand that we have a tight timeline, but that feels like a tactical decision that should be informed by data. It's the default, but it's not the only option that we have available. And I think it'd be really important for a variety of reasons for us to think about different potential ways to bring in revenue that are less impactful to working families in San Diego, but yet also achieve the objective of bringing in the revenue that we need for the system to not only maintain, but to provide the sort of level of service that we want. And so the recommendation that's on here is pretty prescriptive that it is a sales tax measure. I'd be happy to make a motion, Chair, with the exception of swapping out the word revenue for sales tax measure. Excuse me, the word revenue for sales tax, just so it's a little bit more open-ended. I would like to see us be broader in terms of what we initially assess as options. And if the data says that is the only way to go, either because it's the only way to get the revenue that we need or is the only one that's politically viable, I understand that. But narrowing the path so dramatically right now doesn't necessarily feel like a prudent decision from my perspective.
And well, if I could just address that, the reason we put in the sales tax measure is because that's one of the options, and that has a little bit of a lead time. We would need to procure the services of someone to poll and do focus groups, and we would feel that would be, we'd have to get somebody in place by next summer, or this summer, I should say, in order to even see if it's feasible. So that is why we are proposing here that this is something that we should consider. I was in Riverside yesterday as part of the Transit Transformation Task Force. We had a lengthy discussion about all the revenue options that could be out there. Everything from the rights to develop on our property, you know, could we transfer those rights to a different property and sell it to somebody, you know, all the really detailed specifics of the types of things you could use to try to fund transit. Those are very great ideas, but that's not what I'm proposing here, and not because I want to say no to those ideas. It's just that this is because if
Yeah, Sharon, I just really quickly to jump in. I'm not trying to divert us off of a ballot measure. I'm trying to divert us off of solely selecting the sales tax as the ballot measure.
Right.
And making sure that that stays a little bit broader.
Okay.
Because I know we have a tight timeline, but I also think we have enough runway to consider other options besides just a sales tax. I'm gonna starting at like the far end of what would I think be like my ideal would be working with some of our state legislatures to open up SB 83, I think was something that was passed in 2009 that allowed for countywide imposition of vehicle registration fees. That was a 50% plus one threshold. A 50% plus one threshold with vehicle registration fees that would pass in the MTS service area. I'm very confident. It would be far less regressive on working families in San Diego, and could potentially achieve the objective. So that's the only, again, no concern about pursuing a revenue measure. My only concern is narrowing the path to sales tax essentially on day one, rather than stepping back for a second, seeing what our options are, talking to our state legislators, seeing what appetite they might have to provide MTS with that flexibility to put something like that forward. So that we have the greatest opportunity for success, and the greatest opportunity for success that delivers what I think we all aim to do, which is not just provide great service to our MTS riders, but do so in a way that has the least financial impact on working families in San Diego.
And if I could just add, and I don't want to I just want to make sure we understand the scope and what this would be. To be clear, the only measure that this MTS board has like complete control over is the retail and sales tax measure that's in our legislation. So that was what I, as a lawyer, was focused on. But this would be just authorizing staff to start to do the little due diligence, bring back to the board the information you need to decide if you want to do that. And those decisions would not get made by the board until probably March of 2025 at the earliest. So there would be contracts for consultants to help us gather that data, but there wouldn't be any decision to start putting things on the ballot until the March to May timeframe. That being said, to the extent that there's other tax measure options that we could maybe talk with some of our county partners about, we could certainly, we're just looking for today direction of, do you want us to even go work on hiring a consultant to do some of this data collection that would probably be needed for any type of measure that you do? People would want to know what the projects and funding would be. So
yeah, and I think what board member Ela Rivera do this in addition, which would require starting now if we were to get
Yes.
statutory authority.
It's a one word change, swapping out sales tax for revenue so that we keep it. Again, everything would stay there on the ballot for the November 2026 general election. Just asking that we don't solely focus on sales tax, that we keep it more open-ended from right now. That's it.
I will say that this is the first I've heard of this concept, and so I appreciate you bringing that forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if that's where we have to go, that's where we have to go. I just narrowing it now, and we've run successful ballot measures at the city. We've run some that didn't pass, but at this point in time, getting too focused on narrowing the path too quickly it just makes the likelihood of success that much less when it finally ends up on the ballot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Ela Rivera. We'll go to Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Stepp.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, and I will second the motion. I believe that culminated into a motion, so I will second that. And I completely agree that we really cannot, if we move forward with this, we cannot make this decision in a bubble. We have to look at the sentiment of voters right now. We have to evaluate successful and unsuccessful measures. We have to determine how we will communicate. We also need to determine what additional skin in the game MTS is willing to have to broaden the reach of what MTS can do for the broader public. So yes, we certainly have our folks that are intimately involved in all of this like we are, but the majority of people that potentially, if we go to a ballot, we will be asking for support are absolutely not intimately involved in the way we are. And they have a lot of different opinions about where their money is going. First of all, we're already up against the timeline, which we have the fiscal cliff, so I understand the timeline, but that's not good. Because we have not, in my opinion, and the measures that have, that I'm speaking of recently have, barely failed, right? But if we're looking at a 2/3 and we're looking at this timeline, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And we have to be realistic about where we are, because this is extremely important, and finding ways to communicate that has been a challenge for us. So that's, I just want to put those on the record, although I'm supporting this. I'm supporting it with the change, because the regressive kind of models are not popular. And so to kind of open that up to give us more options, it may take a little bit more time, and it definitely will be a little bit more work. But I think that if we have a fighting chance, we have to see, have as many options as possible on the table. Because I'm just seeing the trend in San Diego and in the region, and up and down the state. And I just want to be realistic about it. What I don't want to do is continue to turn people off, which will make it harder and harder and harder for us to continue to go to the ballot. We need a win, right? And not only for the state of mind of folks, but because we're facing a fiscal cliff. And so for that, I'm certainly supportive. I just, moving forward, have a couple of ideas, and these are probably premature for me to talk about now, but we really have been, we have a lot of great engagement in our youth and young adult community that we should continue to tap into. That's going to be very, very important as we talk about measures in a couple years. I do think that certain investment that will cost the line, but may ultimately expose more people to the great things that we do. We have to be creative around that. And I'm talking of, free ride days and things that really reach out the two people that will never go to a town hall and that won't come to the community meetings. That's just being real. Like they're just, people are very busy and doing a lot of things and also just not as involved and engaged. The other thing that the other thing I don't want to be in a bubble about is the federal administration and the potential impacts that we could be facing based on some of the decisions that are being made from the federal to the state and how that kind of trickles down to us. The potential impact of potential mass deportations on our lot, the impact of that on our line and ridership, the potential for another pandemic or at least an epidemic. There's no way for us to really evaluate those things, but also like we've gone through these things before. We should not be caught off guard, right? And be able to navigate through those if and when they have impacts. So I am just really not wanting to make decisions in a bubble. We have the need. We know that there are so many circumstances that are surrounding us that I think in some way they should at least be lifted up in our conversation. And so I will just leave it there. But I do think we have to look at these previous measures, and we need to look at the things we did awesome and the things that just we didn't do well, and then work from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Steppe. Vice Chair Goebel.
Thank you, Chair. There's a saying in business, you can't save your way to prosperity. And the cuts that are shown in Mr. Boyd's presentation, I agree, they're not recommendations by any means. It's just giving you a benchmark to say that. And there is no way we could make all the cuts and still have a robust system. So we know we need new sources of revenue. My question, let's go back to slide number 4. Something happened in 2007 for a 7% ridership gain. What happened to really make that take off after that study? And following up in the 2017 TOP, did we see a similar 7% increase, or what can you tell us?
So the first COA, which was the first one the agency ever did, was really designed to build the system up from the ground. And it was a demand-based system. So MTS basically took over all the bus systems from all of the various cities that were having their own bus systems. And they basically, as legacy systems, they were frequently not, I'm not going to say not well thought out, but they were basically meant to sustain the status quo and weren't really geared towards ridership and building demand and building a bus system that would really accommodate where people wanted to go and where they were coming from. So in 2007, when we implemented that COA that started in 2005, and oddly enough, Brent Boyd was one of our consultants on that effort. We build it around the notion of where are they coming from and where they want to go. And, built a whole network that then produced the ridership gains that you're talking about, because we now build a system that people wanted to use. And it wasn't simply a peanut butter approach to put transit everywhere. And then it didn't really make sense for the vast bulk of people who wanted to use it.
And in 2017, we did the exercise again. Did we see similar things, or was it not as big of a opportunity in 2017 as we had in 2007?
It wasn't as high of an increase, but there was an increase. But then again, it was curtailed very soon by COVID.
Okay.
So it's hard to discern the long-term impacts.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let's talk about new sources of revenue. And Mr. Ela Rivera, thank you for not limiting it to just sales tax. On the state level, is there any talk about the state increasing sales tax to provide all transit agencies, because all of us are in trouble?
So that's one of the things that is on the table as one of the recommendations coming out of the Transit Transformation Task Force is to have the state authorize a doubling of the TDA. That's one. other options aren't really so much as from a state perspective as they are to authorize local governments to do certain things. And so for instance, I bring up the value transfer or the development rights transfer to, that would require a change in local ordinances as well to be able to capture that. So it's an odd thing, but it would be, take our right of way. How many acres is it? What would the zoning be on that if you were going to develop the air rights over it? And then you could sell that to a developer of an adjacent parcel and they would build, and therefore you'd get the money from that sale. All of these things would be on the table once they get the report done in the fall of this year.
Fall of this year. Okay, great. Thanks. Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Steppe, thank you for saying the sentiment of voters and just having a realistic sense of what is out there. 2/3 is big. If Sandag again comes back with another additional half cent, not additional for them, but additional to the discussion, that is a bigger lift for voters to approve too. So how do we get to the sentiment of voters? And I guess I am also seeing a portion of voters who are saying they would like to see everybody participate in this solution. And what I'm talking about there is an analysis of our fares. We haven't increased our fares since 2009. Our operational budget in 2009 was about $210 million, or half of what it is today. We've grown by another $210 million, and we haven't raised fares at all. I think realistically on a ballot proposition, there would be a part of the voters who would say, we want everybody to participate, not just, we want everybody to participate. And so if the maker of the motion is amenable to adding a fair study analysis and recommendation as part of this, I would think that would be something that might help get people to 2/3 and address the sentiment of the voters.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the fair study would be separate and apart from?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We haven't taken.
We would use that data to help inform the decisions we make here.
Absolutely. And part of that study is going to be when you raise fares, you risk losing riders and you start a downward spiral. On the other hand, if you get a boost of all sorts of revenue, not just a sales tax, but from increased fare revenue as well, that can only supersize additional frequency of routes and reach of the routes as well, because everybody participated in that solution. So I'm just asking for a separate fare study.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed, definitely not opposed to that. And I think that a good poll working with a good polling firm that can utilize data from other polls that they've run would be able to help guide us in understanding whether that's a boost or or not. And then certainly we should know what our fares should be in order to provide the services we want without negatively impacting our riders. So I'm not opposed to that.
And that would need the second person to agree as well.
Could I have, just so you understand what a fare change entails, I'll have Israel Maldonado come up. He's our fare administrator.
That's a Sandag related thing, right?
Good morning. My name is Israel Maldonado, Director of Fare Technology and Operations. So to provide a quick summary of what the fare study typically undertakes is we work with Sandag as they oversee the regional fare ordinance to contract a consultant that would then work with the region or partners to the north, NCTD, MTS, Sandag, in developing packages that we would then bring back to the public, to the board for input. These packages would typically have a breakdown of forecast of ridership and estimated revenue increases. The process itself the procurement process of the new consultant takes likely at least a few months, 2 to 3, build up of the packages, another several months, and analysis coming back to the board. And then once a package is identified, there is about a 5-month process of public outreach and meetings that does occur. So out the door, you're looking at about at least a 12-month process for that.
And it would have to be in conjunction with a board approval at Sandag as well as North County Transit District?
That's correct. All of the above, yeah.
I was going to say, I'll second that, but I do recall one of my first votes ever as an elected official was to raise fares in 2018-19, I believe, and there was a Title VI analysis involved, and there's a lot there. So although that was 6-7 years ago, I do recall that. So
we raised the fares on senior disabled.
Yes, and so that was a tough one of first votes, and that's why I remember it, because it was tough.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We will now go to Director Fernandez.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the directors for their comments in total support of broadening our solutions to include different streams of revenue, including a possible fare increase and, of course, a ballot measure. At the risk of getting into the weeds, though, I want to go on record asking a question. Does the COA, we looked at what cutting routes could be, and that's pretty awful. Does the COA include increasing routes to support development in specific areas? Of course, I might be being a little bit selfish here, but thinking of the development going along the Bayfront, do we consider increasing routes in those areas of development?
Yeah, so we'll be looking at 2 different scenarios. One is a service reduction if we don't get additional funding, and the other would be a service enhancement. And we would be able to dramatically increase service, hopefully. And even outside of that, we would be analyzing the entire service area, looking at where demographics are changing, where development is occurring, any changes in expected travel patterns, all that kind of stuff. So we would definitely be part of the considerations.
Thank you. Yield back.
Okay, thank you very much, Director Fernandez. I have a few questions. First of all, I support the idea raised by Director Elo Rivera of looking at alternative or other potential revenue sources. Is there anything about changing sales tax measure to revenue measure that in any way inhibits your ability to explore what would be necessary should you or should this board want to pursue a sales tax measure? Or is that inclusive enough that you can still do what you need to do?
I think it's inclusive enough.
Okay. The comprehensive operational analysis is due to be completed in November 2026, which would presumably inform what we would do after a potential ballot measure in 2026, whether that involved less revenue or more revenue. Is there any way that comprehensive operational analysis can provide us at least some preliminary information along the way that perhaps could inform how we communicate to the public what we might want to do with additional revenues should that become available?
Yeah, it will. So.
Yeah, so as part of the COA, we'll be doing significant outreach to the public. And again, we'll be talking about potential service enhancements. So as part of that outreach, we'll be getting a lot of feedback regarding proposed projects, where we should enhance service, where we should add service, that type of thing. So there'll be significant public outreach, getting feedback back.
Okay, so by the time we're making a decision, if we are making a decision in the spring of 2026, we'll at least have some information that we could use to communicate to the public around that.
Yeah, and in fact, the marketing department's already been looking at a number of different tools that we can reach out to the public with to get feedback. So that the preliminary effort there, so they're already underway.
Okay. To be clear, if there were a 55% ballot measure where the threshold were reduced to 55%, we wouldn't know that in advance. It'd be presumably on the 2026 ballot at the same time as some other ballot measure were on there, and the measure would pass either with 2/3 if the 55% measure didn't pass, or with 55% if that were adopted by the voters in that election. Let me ask one last question, and that is the scope of the financial scenarios that we're going to be exploring. I understand exploring cuts of 30 to 50 million. You're talking about exploring revenue increases of 75 million, but at the same time, if there were a ballot measure, it could bring up to 300 million. So explain to me that delta. Why would we not be exploring these scenarios under a revenue increase of 300 million?
Well, so if there's a ballot measure and we get 300 million or so, there'll be a number of different buckets that money could go to. It could go to fares. It could go to increased security, really enhanced infrastructure projects and that type of thing. So there's a whole number of buckets that money can go to. Right now, we've identified 75 million of that to go to just enhancements to the current network, frequency enhancements, span enhancements, that type of thing. But it really is just a placeholder right now. We have that in the RFP, but we've identified that we can change that number as we get closer, and that number can be refined as we go forward.
And I think in Elevate, it was a third or something like that. So a third to enhance the existing system, and a third for capital improvements. And I forget what the other
security.
And then security and free fares for youth and some other things as well. So.
Okay, so when we're talking about 75 million, we're not talking about the total amount of the additional revenue. We're talking about the amount of the additional revenue that would go towards service enhancements.
Correct.
Okay, good. All right. Seeing no further questions on this, we have.
Do you want me to read what I think is the
let's restate the motion. That'd be good.
So pursue a comprehensive operational analysis to be completed by November 2026. And begin preliminary efforts on researching the feasibility of a transit revenue measure for the MTS service area only. And further work with SANDAG and NCTD to conduct a fare study regarding potential impacts of a fare increase.
I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. So that is the motion that is in front of us that has been made by Director Elo Rivera and seconded by Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Stepp. Seeing no further discussion on the motion, clerk, please call the roll.
Please make your selections. Chair, the motion passes with 6 members voting yes and 1 member absent.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for the good discussion on that item. That'll take us to our final discussion item of the morning, and that is item 7, structural budget deficit planning. And we're going to get this presentation from Gordon Meyer. Please feel free to get settled in, and when you're ready, feel free to begin with the presentation.
And I will mention on this one, this is going to be proposing some short-term actions to recommend to the board, as well as some potential long-term actions that would kind of dovetail on what we just did on the last agenda item.
All right, good morning. My name is Gordon Meyer. I'm the manager of financial planning here at MTS. And as Sharon just touched on, we are going to discuss our structural budget deficit planning this morning. So I wanted to give a brief overview of what we're going to cover in this meeting. So first, I'll give a very brief update on our budget development process and where we stand today. We'll take a look at the first 5 months of budget to actuals for our FY25 operating budget, so results through November. Then we'll take a look at a high-level forecast of the FY25 amended budget. We are doing the full build-out of that budget currently, and we're bringing that to the board soon. And then we'll also look at an updated 5-year forecast that's been updated since the version that you saw in Mike Thompson's presentation at the last board meeting. And then we'll segue from there to a discussion of the scope of the fiscal cliff, some of the upcoming challenges we're facing as an agency, And then we'll also review some potential strategies for delaying the fiscal cliff. And then ultimately, we do have a recommendation at the end. So we'll cover that as well as its projected impact. So I just want to give a brief update on the budget development process. So the original FY25 operating budget was adopted on June 20th, 24. Since that time, we do bring monthly status updates to the board on the consent calendar. That's the written budget to actuals report that covers the trends we're seeing so far. We do a forecast of the operating budget on a monthly basis. So that's part of what we're presenting today. And then just wanted to cover that the mid-year amendment is not completed yet. It's currently underway. We started in January. We met with all of the departments to review their current and proposed spending trends. We also compile a list of all headcount changes and proposed changes to personnel. We look at revenue forecasts and all the other expenses, and then we ultimately consolidate those changes, and we plan on presenting the draft of the official mid-year amendment to the board on March 13th. As far as next year's budget goes, we start that process at the same time as we start the mid-year amendment. So during our meetings with all the managers, we also talk about the upcoming fiscal year and get the desired spending amounts for next year as well. We do need a couple more months for the FY26 process, as that's a zero-based budget. We build it from the ground up. We do not automatically approve spending levels based on the prior year. Each line item must be justified based on that year's needs. And so we will have multiple executive committee or BDC meetings with adoption for next year's budget planned by around May 15th, 2025. So now we'll move on to the operating budget performance so far through November. And we'll first look at operating revenues. The first line there is fair revenue. So far, we were unfavorable by 284,000 or just under 1%. Although we were slightly unfavorable to budget, we are trending about 7% higher than last year, which is about $2.1 million higher. On the ridership side, we're actually doing much better. We're trending about 13.6% higher, which is about 3.4 million passengers. However, offsetting that increase in ridership year over year is a decrease in our average fare. So we are trending about 5.4% lower than last year. We're currently at 92 cents per passenger versus 97 cents last year. We do expect to see some improvements there as we begin the new fare enforcement policy that just went into effect on February 1st. Next line, we have other operating revenue. So this includes our advertising revenue, energy credit revenue, interest revenue. So here we're trending slightly favorable by about 83,000 so far. So overall operating revenues are 202,000 unfavorable through the first 5 months. Moving on to expenses. So personnel costs is one of our major variances this year. We're trending about $2 million favorable so far, or 2.4%. A couple of things driving this. First, we have favorable security and flagging wages. If you'll remember, last year, the board approved 47 new positions, security positions to enhance security as part of our SB 125 plan. The hiring on that side has been slower than what we had initially projected, so we are seeing savings there. We had also built in budget for additional flagging positions to ramp up for the Orange Line construction. That's not scheduled to actually begin until late this fiscal year or next fiscal year. And so we'll be revising those wages down this year just based on when we actually hire those positions. And then we also have some savings on the San Diego Transit defined contribution plans as well as healthcare costs. We do expect that to tighten up in the second half of the year with the new CBAs that just went into effect in January. Next line, purchase transportation. So that's our fixed route and paratransit contracted service. So we're very close to budget so far, 237,000 or less than about 0.5% unfavorable. Other outside services, 653,000 unfavorable so far. We're having a bad year for engines and transmission repairs. Those are as needed repairs, and the engine goes down and then we have to send that to a vendor for repairs. We've seen an increase in that this year. And then also CCTV maintenance expenses. We used to fund those in the capital budget. Based on the fact that we're doing replacements of individual components now, it's more of a repair. So we started charging those to the operating budget instead. So we'll be adding budget for that during the mid-year amendment. Energy is the other major variance here so far, and it's good news. We're trending about $2 million favorable, or 9.2% so far, and that's all due to commodity rates for both CNG and electricity. We've continued to see a normalization back to historical commodity prices that were sky high towards the tail end of the pandemic. And so overall operating expenses so far through November are almost $3 million favorable, or about 1.6%. So here you can see when we combine revenues and expenses together, we're trending about 2.7 million favorable, or 2% in the operating budget so far. Now, the numbers that you see here and that we just covered do not include subsidy revenue. The subsidy isn't reported until June, when we have all the final cash receipts and we have our final grant allocations. However, we do have news regarding subsidy revenue that we will talk about more on the coming forecast slides, but we are seeing sales tax receipts trailing forecasts. The state just revised its state transit assistance target lower, and so that will have an impact to our FY25 budget as well. And then also important to note is that this operating budget, the original operating budget, did not include any of the Senate Bill 125 funds. So for those of you who were here last year, if you'll remember, we were initially presenting a budget that assumed we were going to receive all of the SB 125 funds from the state. Then the state had their kind of a budget crisis, and they were balancing their budget. We ultimately ended up taking out all of the SB 125 funds from our assumption. However, we have received the payments of those funds. And so as part of the mid-year amendment this year, we will be including all of the SB 125 that we originally planned on receiving. And then just a reminder, it's good news here, 2.7 million favorable so far, but this budget does include 78.6 million in non-recurring funds. So that's stimulus, Senate Bill 125, as well as reserves that we are using to balance this budget this year. And so that's how we're looking so far. So taking that experience into account, and then also layering on our expectations for the second half of the year, we did come up with this the FY 2025 forecast. And so you can see the top line in this forecast for operating revenues, we are projecting about a $2 million increase in revenues. That's mostly on the passenger revenue side. We just started the new fare enforcement action on February 1st. So we are building in some passenger revenue growth for that. And we're also adding in, we just added the 15-minute frequency across the entire trolley line at the end of January 2025. And we also implemented the Route 910 overnight express. So we are building in a little bit of revenue for those additional services as well. Next line, we have recurring subsidies. So you can see we are forecasting a decrease of about 5 million here. That reflects the slowing sales tax revenues that is being projected by SANDAG at this time. So overall, recurring revenues are forecasted to decrease by about $3 million from the original budget. And then next line down, you can see our forecasted expenses. We are projecting an increase of about 2.8 million, or 0.6%. Couple things, because we just looked at the past few slides and saw that we're favorable by almost $3 million. But we just added about $4.5 million of service that was in our SB 125 plan. That's the trolley service enhancements in the Route 910. So we're adding that into the projected expenses. And then things like personnel will tighten up dramatically in the second half of the year, since the new collective bargaining agreements for ATU, IBEW, and SMART just went into effect in January, and they had some significant increases. So the red line here, you can see our projected structural deficit. We are projecting a structural deficit of 84.5 million in this forecast, which is an increase in the deficit of 5.8 million from the original budget. Now, in order to get to our overall balanced budget, we have to add in the one-time funding. And so you can see Reserves, we're now planning to use 25.5 million in reserves. That's an actual decrease from what we were originally projecting. And the reason for that is because we're receiving the 12 million in SB 125 funds. So about 7.5 million of the items that are being funded with the SB 125 funding were already included in our expenses because we were going to move forward with those regardless. So that's the security and the Iris Rapid. And so getting the funding for those services directly reduced our reserves usage. We also have 47 million in stimulus funds, which is our last batch of stimulus funds. And then as discussed, we're adding the 12 million in SB 125 funding for this year. So now that we looked at FY25, we looked ahead and did an updated 5-year forecast. Before we look at the actual forecast, I want to cover some of the major themes that we're building into the forecast. And first, we'll start with our revenue assumptions. So one of the bigger pieces of news for us recently has been the updated forecast for our sales tax revenue, which is our TDA and Transnet. So Sandag provided an update to us in January, and they are revising the targets downward, not only for this year in FY25, but dramatically in FY26, specifically for TDA. And so they are projecting a decrease next year for TDA receipts of 3.6% year over year. So that's on top of the lowered FY25 expectation. And for MTS, it actually comes out to about a $14.6 million reduction or 16% reduction to the amount available to our operating budget. So after sharing with capital, the other sales tax revenue source for us is Transnet. And so that is now projected to only grow by under 0.5% for FY26, which is well below the targets that we've been assuming in prior forecasts. Fortunately, about 44% of our overall Transnet funding is reimbursement based by Sandag. So it's a reimbursement for the net cost of operating BRTs in Midcoast. However, it still has a significant impact on our 5-year forecast by reducing the formula share of Transnet. Also central to our revenue assumptions is passenger revenue. So we do project passenger revenue to grow, but not return to its pre-pandemic levels until FY29, as you can see in the bottom table to the right. We are assuming about 6% organic growth per year, and then we're also building in about $7 million per year as anticipated revenue for the increased fare enforcement. Now that $7 million really remains to be seen. We didn't build in like the total amount of estimated fare evasion loss, but we are taking a portion of that. And then also uncertain is that this 5-year forecast also assumes federal revenue is stable. And so moving on to the expense side of our 5-year forecast assumptions. So you can see we take the revised forecast for FY25 and what we know about FY26, and then we layer on assumptions around CPI, wages and benefits, our purchase transportation contract rates, energy, and then we apply those to the out years to come up with our overall projected expenses. Major contributor, though, is service levels. And so in the 5-year forecast that we'll get to on the next slide, very important to note that it assumes that all additional bus and trolley service enhancements that were included in our SB 125 plan will be implemented. And not only that they'll be implemented, but continue past the availability of SB 125 funds, meaning we weren't planning on adding a bunch of service and then taking it back immediately because we run out of SB 125 funds. So specifically, it includes 22 million in future bus service enhancements that were planned from 27 through FY28, and then about $9 million in future trolley service enhancements, which specifically was moving to 7.5 headways on the entire blue line. And so here's what the updated forecast looks like. You can see operating revenues, recurring revenues, they grow, however, not as fast as total projected expenses. And so our structural deficit in this forecast is projected to go from about 84.5 million in FY25 and grow pretty steadily to 130 million by FY29. And most importantly on this slide is if you look at the bottom line, we are projected to be able to cover our expenses with one-time funding through the end of FY27. And then in this forecast, we're projecting to hit the fiscal cliff pretty early in fiscal year 28, where we'd be facing a $93 million true deficit. And so this obviously poses challenges for the agencies. So our main challenge going forward will be addressing the structural deficit and preparing for the upcoming fiscal cliff. Kind of specific to that problem is we are now seeing a slowing of sales tax revenues. Fare evasion has been a problem for us, and we still need to wait and see how the new enforcement actually affects passenger revenue. Ridership is still below its pre-pandemic levels. We also have significant capital needs over the next 5 years. So in our most recent forecast, we have a 5-year deficit reaching 463 million on the capital side, which represents about 65% funded ratio. This does include the cost of a zero-emission bus implementation and the compliance with the state's Innovative Clean Transit or ICT regulation. Another challenge could be the FTA apportionments and reauthorization. Our current legislation expires in September of 2026. Full Transnet reimbursement for BRT and Midcoast is only guaranteed through 2030 by SANDAG. And then lastly, some of the things that we've discussed already today, a potential ballot measure, potential TDA reform, or other revenue sources are uncertain. And so we really can't build those into our financial planning right now. And so we have met, and the staff have come up with a list of what we think are potential solutions to deal with these issues. Any of these solutions, whether short-term or long-term, will require directions from the BDC or EC and board for both short-term and long-term strategies for MTS sustainability. And so our overarching goal of this will be to extend the timing of the fiscal cliff and then ultimately eliminate the structural deficit through either reduced expenses, increased revenues, or most likely a combination of both. And so our target is roughly $120 million per year that we need to reduce from our structural deficit. And it will likely require a combination of strategies at different stages and dependent upon certain outcomes, specifically around revenue. And so we've broken some of the strategies into short-term and long-term, and this is more of a menu of what we've identified. We do have a recommendation of some of these that we'll get to at the end of the presentation. But some of the things that we could do in the short term is we could do minor service reductions or delay any further service enhancements. We've already touched on what's in our SB 125 plan currently. We have 22 million in future bus enhancements that were planned, and then moving to the 7.5 million or minute service on the blue line as well. That was about $9 million in total. And so we could pause moving forward with those services and then use that SB 125 funding to go towards structural deficit balancing. We already have 126 million in our plan for doing so. So it would be really a transfer between existing line items in our SB 125 plan. And what that would really mean is maintaining service at their January 2025 levels and not moving forward with any other service additions as we don't have a dedicated funding source. Another potential solution is that in the short term is to exercise the Innovative Clean Transit or ICT off-ramp. So the ICT requires that large transit agencies purchase 50% zero-emission buses for all new bus orders on or after January 1st of 2026. The requirement then increases to 100% for new purchases being zero emission on January 1st of 2029. And so the challenge with that is that zero emission buses cost on average about 40 to 50% more than their CNG equivalents. And they also have a lower range, meaning we may need to purchase additional buses for some of our longer routes to operate the same amount of service. I did want to note here that MTS was an early adopter, meaning that we purchased an amount of zero emission buses above and beyond the minimum requirements of the regulation. By doing so, we generated 25 credits. These credits can be used to reduce the purchasing requirement in future years. So we do have that at our disposal. And in addition to the zero emission bus costs themselves, we also have significant capital investment needs to support the vehicle requirements, specifically charging infrastructure. So currently we have 5 existing bus divisions that would need to be outfitted with charging infrastructure. In order to completely build all 5 of those facilities out, it would cost an estimated 500 to 600 million. Also, in order to accommodate our fleet size, we would also need to build a brand new 6th division, the Clean Transit Advancement Campus, or CTAC. And the cost to implement that division and with construction would be estimated about 250 million to 350 million by itself. And so really what this means, and kind of the strategy that's in our disposal, is that we could request the delay of the zero emission bus transition plan. Specifically, we could reduce future vehicle purchases by utilizing our 25 credits. And then you also can request a temporary delay from CARB for the purchasing requirements of the ICT. We would also be able to delay future infrastructure phases, specifically delay construction of the Clean Transit Advancement Campus, and then delay future phases of our transition at the existing bus divisions as well. Very important to note that going this route would require MTS board approval prior to submitting a formal submission to CARB for delaying the requirements. And then the request for a delay is only valid for 1 year. So this is something that we need to reapply for on an annual basis, and we could reassess on an annual basis as well. And so really, this kind of builds on or is related to requesting an off-ramp from the ICT, but our goal is really to shift recurring capital funding from the capital budget to the operating budget in the short term. And so we've identified, based on revenue requirements, that we could safely shift between 25 and 50 million per year in flexible funding annually. That would come in the form of STA and TDA. And that's, when I say it's flexible and you could safely shift, I mean that it's local funding. And so there's no grant requirements on what it can be spent for. It's flexible in nature. And so that's a possibility that we can move forward with, though it does come with a significant impact to our capital budget. And so, as mentioned already, the capital program is already projected to be less than 65% funded over the next 5 years. And essentially, we would need to delay more projects. And so at the very highest level, our CIP projects can be right now kind of divided into state of good repair projects, which are bus replacements, infrastructure replacements, and zero emission projects. So those are the 2 major categories that are in our 20-year plan. And so what we've identified as possibilities, you can shift from state of good repair, but what we're recommending, and we'll get to on the later slides, is it would potentially reduce ICT projects in our FY26 through FY28 CIPs, specifically reducing our zero emission bus purchases by using our credits, and also requesting delays to the ICT requirements, and then delaying the infrastructure build out, specifically the later phases at our existing bus divisions, and then also delaying the CTAC construction. And then I just want to highlight that the FY26 through FY28 CIPs is where we would be reflecting these. We're not talking about moving funding from any projects that have already been approved by the board. So this would be reducing investment needs in future CIPs. And so that covers most of the short-term solutions that we've identified. Some of the longer-term strategies for delaying the fiscal cliff include those mentioned on the next couple slides. So the Transit Transformation Task Force, as Sharon has already mentioned, that's a group that was created by Senate Bill 125 to kind of come up with sustainable options for transit, increasing revenue, increasing ridership, et cetera. And they are exploring the potential statewide doubling of the sales tax. That has the potential to increase operating budget by $140 million per year. That would cover most of the projected deficit by itself. However, the timing and the outlook is uncertain at this point, so we can't build that into our fiscal assumptions as we move forward in the short term. Also, the ballot measure, we've spent time talking about that today, so I won't go too much into it, but the prior Elevate SD package was estimated to generate about $300 million per year. About a third of that would need to go to existing operations for this round. And it also faces a 2/3 voting requirement. So it'd be a tough sell, especially with so much going to existing operations. Also, longer term potential solutions is we could look at fare increases. The last major fare change was in 2009. Just for reference, if we had increased our $72 monthly pass in line with inflation since 2009, it would cost $110 today. And then already touched on is this must be coordinated regionally and conducted by SANDAG as well, and would be accompanied by a fare study too. And then lastly, we are recommending the comprehensive operational analysis to guide any major service reductions, but also service increases as we've talked about in the prior presentation. And so that brings us, that's kind of the menu of options that we've identified. And then now we have what we're actually recommending in the short term. And so we do recommend exercising the innovative clean transit off-ramp provisions, which is delay the requirements. There is no blanket exemption from the ICT regulation. And by doing so in the short term, it would provide maximum flexibility of our capital funds while also minimizing the impact to the state of good repair projects. So things that could impact service reliability, safety, et cetera. And our ultimate goal in the short term is to shift flexible funds from the CIP to the operating budget beginning in FY26. Specifically, we're recommending a shift of $25 million in the FY26 CIP, $35 million in FY27, and then $50 million in FY28. We'd like to see the results of the increased fare enforcement to see how that actually impacts our passenger revenues, so we can reflect that going forward in our forecasts and budgets. And then we're recommending maintaining service at their levels today. So that would mean leaving the trolley service that we just implemented at the end of this January, but not moving forward with the 7.5-minute Blue Line service in FY26 and beyond. It would also include removing the $22 million in future planned bus service enhancements from our FY27 and FY28 SB 125 plan as well. And then this was, I think, touched on a little bit, but we could also we'd like to use the data from the COA to come up with any minor restructuring of services or efficiency gains with minor budget savings where possible. And then ultimately, we need to see the results of the Transit Transformational Task Force, as well as make a decision, and then also see the outcome of a potential ballot measure. So this slide is a projected look if we were to implement our short-term strategies. So specifically, that's removing the future bus and trolley service enhancements. And then also about 3 lines up for the bottom, you can see it also includes the shifting of capital funds to the operating budget. That's the $25 million in 26 and then 35 and 50 in the next 2 years. And so by moving forward with this short-term recommendation, we'd essentially be buying another year until we hit the fiscal cliff. So you can see we would make it all the way, we'd be balanced through FY28 and then be expected to hit the fiscal cliff in about the first half of FY29. So this would provide additional time to determine the outcomes of the potential revenue sources. but it would not solve our structural deficit. And so this brings me to the final staff recommendation that the MTS Executive Committee forward a recommendation to the Board of Directors to exercise the innovative clean transit off-ramp provisions to provide the flexibility of capital funds in the short term while minimizing the impact to the state of good repair projects. Shift the flexible funds from the CIP to the operating budget beginning in FY26. And then also maintain service levels at the January 25 levels and delay the future bus and trolley service enhancements that were included in our SB 125 plan. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
Yes, we do. We have several. Alex Wong, if you can please make your way to the podium.
In order to plug the operating deficit, I urge MTS to exercise the innovative clean transit off-ramp and delay bus electrification. This will allow money to be shifted away from the bus electrification and towards operations. This is wise. Passengers care far more that bus service is frequent and reliable than whether the bus is natural gas or electric. Let's not shift money away from state of good repair, but we should delay capital projects not necessary for state of good repair and shift those funds towards sustaining operations. Let's not cut service and let's not delay improving service. Instead, let's first delay bus electrification. We should also shift service away from low ridership, highly subsidized bus routes and reallocate it towards high ridership, cost-effective routes. This will further increase riderships and fare revenues even more without increasing operating expenses, because riders value quality before quantity and prefer fewer bus routes with more frequency than tons of bus routes with less frequency.
Corey Schumacher, please make your way to the podium.
Good morning, board. My name is Corey Schumacher. I'm here representing the 3,700 members of IBEW 569. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague Alex here and encourage you to continue to prioritize CIP funding for the Innovative Clean Transit Initiative as well as the ZEB transition plan. It is absolutely laudable that you all took the forward-looking step to chase after these programs and put MTS and the region, San Diego region, into the future in this way. We believe that it is a false choice, cutting services against funding this infrastructure. And in fact, there's been multiple attempts to try to move the goalposts for these programs since they've been implemented. And we would ask that you aggressively hold on to these options and ask staff to bring back other options. The two options that are presented before you, I don't believe are the best choices for you or our region. And I would also note that some of our community partners, the continued particulates that spew in their neighborhoods are continuing to damage the folks who don't need this type of exhaust in their neighborhoods, and we stand in support with them. So we would ask that you request that staff bring back more options. Thank you.
Casey Gupta, please make your way to the podium.
Oh, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm here because riders are hurting. Every time we cut transit service, every time we delay transit improvements, it hurts the people that depend on transit to get to work, school, and medical appointments. We've made rushed, half-baked decisions many times before, and are we really going to make this mistake another time? Let's be clear, we don't need to cut service to fix the deficit. We can eliminate it in just 1 year by pursuing efficiency and savings. In just a few hours of analyzing MTS budget, I identified over $80 million in savings without cutting a single bus route. If a high school student can do that, imagine what an independent third-party auditor could do. And here's the key. One change is all it takes to turn this around. A real independent audit would not only find savings, but it would restore faith in MTS operations. Right now, riders don't trust that their fares lead to better service, and voters don't trust that their tax dollars are being used wisely. But with transparency and accountability, we can convince the public and win back support and build a stronger transit system. Other cities have done this time and time again. In Los Angeles, they just saved millions of dollars through operational improvements while keeping service 100% intact. This wasn't a lucky break. These were smart, data-backed decisions. In the last fiscal year budget, the MTA in New York City saved $500 million without cutting a single bus service hour, just by making operational improvements. San Diego can do the same, but not if we keep making reactionary cuts that push us further into decline. I'm asking you, just one of you, one director to take this on, one director to step up, demand an audit, push for real efficiency and savings instead of punishing riders that need improved transit service the most. I don't have power here. I'm a transit rider. I want to be a transit planner one day, and you guys are such cool people, but you guys have the power to make a difference. I'm asking you today, who's willing to stand up for riders and fix this the right way?
Your time has expired. Anselmo Estrada, please make your way to the podium.
Good morning, Executive Committee. Once again, Anselmo Estrada, the San Diego Building and Construction Trades Council. I want to echo the comments made by my sister, Corey Schumacher, representative of IBW 569. Oftentimes, I've heard it many times over my career in San Diego, we're presented with two choices, each of them equally bad. I urge you to direct staff to look for additional ways to solve this issue. You know, it's been referenced earlier, Steve. I appreciated your comments in the last item when we've all noticed that if we invest in these systems, if we build these systems out, people will ride them. People will ride them, and that includes things like ZEB and investing in our infrastructure. We cannot continue to have this be a if and discussion. We got to find a way to do this. We got to find a way to move forward on providing exceptional services as well as investing in this system. We are going to only continue to grow. The issues that we've been facing and we continue to face are only going to continue to be dropped into our lap, but we cannot backslide here. Thank you.
Carolina Martinez, please make your way to the podium. Okay, thank you. Manny Rodriguez, please make your way to the podium.
Good morning, board. It's great to see you here today. I'm Manny on behalf of City Heights Community Development, here to express relief that we're not seeing transit cuts right now. You do have a big decision ahead of you, and we're just here to reiterate that if that decision does ever come, not to make cuts in transit-dependent communities, that cuts across the board are not fair to all people. Some people are more impacted than others. So if that decision does come, we respectfully ask that transit-dependent communities be prioritized in this decision-making process, as they're the ones who will be most impacted by the changes you make with these decisions. We are also supportive of a ballot measure, but would like to reiterate, the points made by Supervisor Montgomery Stepp that 2/3 is quite frankly unrealistic, and we are setting up ourselves for failure. I would urge the board to continue their efforts to work with the Transit Association to lower that threshold to 55%. Thank you.
Chair, that concludes public comments.
Thank you, Clerk. We will now open committee member discussion on this item, beginning with Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Stepp.
Thank you so much, Chair. Appreciate the presentation. This is a really tough place, I know, for staff to be in. For additional context for myself and for my memory, since I don't have a good one anymore, as we were going through and making these decisions, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the proposal of the off-ramp but also the service enhancements, particularly on the Blue Line, was the thought process that we would have additional funding, possibly through one of the measures that was on this last ballot, or were we making those decisions, understanding I knew we understand that we would have a face a fiscal cliff, but I guess I'm asking, what is the purpose of bringing them now? Is it just simply for awareness and to buy us another year? And then, what was the context in which the previous recommendations were brought forward to us in that we were moving forward with these projects and with these service enhancements?
This is really just to buy us a little bit more time so we can pursue a longer term sustainability and ultimately putting in the major service reductions. If we had to do that starting in 2027, this would give us a little bit more buffer as well. So that's really what we're asking today is, can we buy some more time?
So, and I really do appreciate this. I know that this is tough. And in my comments around the ballot measure and the COA, I mentioned that if we are moving forward with those, it is important that we do have as robust of a system as possible so that our community members abroad understand, the benefits that the line does bring to them and could bring to them if they're choice riders as well. My concern is that if we move forward with the off ramp and then the not increasing these service enhancements, which is what we've talked about. And there's somewhat of an expectation of that we would be long term, also within a 2-year span of possibly bringing a ballot measure, working against ourselves and doing that. That's particularly with the service enhancements, not as much with the off ramp, which I have issues with too, but with the service enhancements, I have, I'm concerned about that. I really am. And I know it's in there, but remind me again, the annual cost of this service enhancement for the Blue Line, going from the 15-minute to the 7.5 minute or 10 minute to 7.5 minute.
So both of the changes combined are about 6 million per year, and it's roughly half. So we're estimating about 3 million a year for the change that we just did in January for going to 15-minute service. So that we are not proposing taking away. But the future service enhancement would be the 7.5 minute service on the Blue Line, which is also estimated to cost about $3 million per year. High level preliminary forecast.
Okay.
Could I just add on to your first comments about if we don't do these things, meaning we can't find that money to extend it to FY28, then we would be looking at doing a service reduction, public hearing and everything else right when the ballot initiative would be there.
Okay.
So in other words, we'd have to start the process of cutting the service because the fiscal cliff is projected right now for FY27. 28, beginning of 20, but it would be calendar year 27.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the timing is horrible either way.
Okay. Well, let me just ask a couple additional questions since I know it's we need to move forward, and that's just what percentage right now are based on our entire fleet. What is the percentage of our electric buses right now?
I'll call up Mike Wygant, Chief Operating Officer for bus.
Thank you. As Sharon mentioned, Mike Wygant, Chief Operating Officer here at MTS Over Transit Services. Of our heavy duty fleet, it's about 5%. We have 25 vehicles now, and we have 13 more that are being constructed right now and being serviced this summer.
Okay, and the proposed changes don't impact the 13 now that are being built?
No, we are committed to those. They are literally line entering next week, and the infrastructure is in place for those.
Okay.
And what would this, if we took the credits that we've earned for early adoption, what would you propose for the next two CIPs for bus purchases?
Yeah, so the first step, if the board's direction was to move forward that way, we are scheduled to buy this in the next month or so. We would have to complete another order. We're scheduled to complete another order with our manufacturer, and that would be for 28 vehicles, 7 of which by the regulation are supposed to be battery electric. My first proposal would to be exercising those credits for those. I would actually, if the board's direction continues down this path and not increasing service as we originally had projected, I think we can forego replacing those 7 battery electrics with CNG. So in other words, we would just buy 21 vehicles. And then in October, we have another 20 vehicles that would have to be ordered. And I would recommend using the credits for those. Depending on what happens with service levels, we may have to replace what originally was projected as battery electric with the CNG to maintain a state of good repair. So I see us exercising the majority, if not all of our options before the end of this year for a couple of reasons. One, to get us, buy us some time, but also the ICT regulation has a threshold date of January 1st, where, as was mentioned previously, we moved to 50%. And so now we're starting, instead of maybe 13 vehicles on average a year, battery electric or zero emission, could be hydrogen, we'd be moving to 25 or closer to 30 to maintain a state of good repair for a 1-for-1 replacement.
Okay, I'm just going to request a briefing for the impact of the clean transportation advancement, the campus, how that would change our overall plan that we have had for building our infrastructure and having that to support the buses that we were originally planned to have online, what that would do, because that's a longer term plan. And it's kind of a lot to go through here, but I would like to see what impact that would have overall. I mean, I don't want the delay to be, okay, we're going to, scrap some of the requirements, even though I know that they're state mandated. So that's my concern.
Yeah, and one of the things with the CTEC that wasn't mentioned was that it really relies on us getting a major grant from the federal government. And
okay, enough said. No, I'm just joking. No, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I really thank you for that. Just the last question is around the task force, the Transportation Transformation Task Force. It was mentioned in the slide, I think that 12 or 13, about one of the ideas that came out of the statewide measure. Are there any other ideas that came out of the task force, outside of that, the statewide ballot measure?
You mean for funding transit, additional funding to transit?
Yes.
We really didn't get a lot of feedback on that. In our conversations, there was a lot of talk about how much the state funds transit. It actually is fairly low. We're not, funded the way New York MTA gets funded and things like that. So we're going to continue that conversation at the next meeting, which is in March. But so far, we haven't really gotten any major type of ideas about funding. Another one that's being floated is, could they extend SB 125? Another, amount of money. And so that's out there as well. And I did sign off on a letter that's going to be going to the legislature with that as a proposal. Other than that, I don't have any major, they talk about a lot about joint development. Can we change the Surplus Land Act to help us to capture more of our funding from that? A lot of discussions about rezoning, enhancing zoning. Yeah.
Okay.
lowering the threshold for sales tax measures, things like that.
All right. Since these services and projects are not out in our community right now, we technically would not be taking anything away. That is my understanding, right? We wouldn't continue on with decisions we've made as a board. But we wouldn't be taking anything away based on what is out there right now. Okay. All right. Those are my questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Steppe. We'll go to Director Dillard.
Thank you, Chair. I just have two questions. If I could ask about page number 7. This is regarding the security. You mentioned security hiring, and you mentioned the word 45, but I didn't know if that was 45% to capacity or if that was, we were short 45% still. So my question is, was there a percentage that were short, which is what I think you were saying, or was it a number, that 45? I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that.
I think, so we hired 40, or we had board authority to hire 47 additional security positions. That started in FY24. And that, so in total is 47 new positions. Most of them have been hired.
Okay.
I think we're short maybe 10 code compliance inspectors as of January. So we're really, I'm guessing, I want to overspeak. Tim's here. He can give you the most up-to-date information, but we're getting closer.
Good morning, Tim Kern. I'm the Director of Transit Security and Passenger Safety. With the increased staffing that we were authorized last year, that would have brought us up to 95 code compliance inspectors to be fully staffed. Today, we're at 86.
Okay.
So we anticipate hiring the remainder of that on March 3rd. But
Okay.
through attrition, we are losing a few throughout the year. So,
Okay.
but we're very close.
Okay.
All other positions have been filled.
Okay, thank you for that. And then with that information, under the structural deficit that you are showing, does it include up to the full capacity of 97, or did you just use the current number?
So the forecast, when we updated the wage forecast, we assumed that we get to full staffing on the security side. I think I had it starting in January. So we built a forecast on when we anticipate to hire those last 10. So it is reflective of what we're actually expecting in the second half of the year. And we were quite a bit lower in the beginning of the year. That's why the savings number on the personnel side was a pretty decent number. But we do expect it to tighten up and be right on target with what we originally budgeted for the second half.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that because I wasn't sure if you were using the total amount that you're expecting or if you were using the current. So thank you for that information. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Director Dillard. We'll go to Vice Chair Goebel.
Thank you, Chair. Nice presentation. A lot of thought to all those things. Thank you. My question is back on slide 13. The third bullet point, ZEBs cost 50% more than CNG. Is that the capital cost of the bus purchase itself or the operating cost?
It's the capital cost of the purchase itself. Yeah.
Okay. So as we look at the impact of the conversion from ZEB to ZEB, there's certainly a capital cost, but there's also an operating cost. What can you tell us about the operating costs of ZEBs versus CNGs?
That's a great question. Again, Mike Wygant, Chief Operating Officer. Right now, we're seeing about a 25 cents improvement in operating cost if you include the cost of charging versus fuel to a CNG vehicle for a battery electric. So there's a bit of an advantage to that, but it's hard to tell over the life of the vehicle if that trend will continue. Most of our zero emission vehicles are on warranty right now. And there's the thought process that eventually the batteries will degrade to the point where they will need a midlife replacement. So I suspect that that will probably, over the life of the vehicle, probably level out, and it may even kind of increase. That is the operating cost, as you mentioned, compared to a total cost of ownership. It's not even comparable.
And let's talk about just technology. I mean, is the technology there that it's mile for mile?
So right now in our system, the way we deploy zero emission vehicles, you obviously have to have the infrastructure, and they have range limitations with the 25 vehicles that we have right now. Currently, you can bank on the fact that they'll get about 125 to about 135 miles. You can pick any block in our system and they can fulfill that. We have CNG vehicles like on the 235, they'll do 500 miles a day. That's well outside any battery electric or hydrogen capacity. So they're not a 1-for-1 in that point. But in our system, about 47% of all of our blocks are 150 miles or less. So there's quite a few areas that we can put the zero emission vehicles and the range doesn't come into play. Is that?
Yes, it does. So I think if we're talking about an off ramp, we have a little bit more room that we actually could buy more ZEBs and do that. But with today's technology, it just wouldn't be a 1-for-1 swap on a CNG versus ZEB, and we'd have to buy 2 buses versus 1. And I don't think that was the intent of the legislation. So at some point we have to talk about, even if we had the money and wanted to do this, the technology's still catching up.
Correct. And that was, and I was part of at the state level, kind of the settlement of what is now the ICT or the amendment to the urban fleet rules, which is what we're dealing with today. And that was a big discussion. Would the technology, would the funding, would the infrastructure, would the grid all be available to support those? All of those were considerations as part of an off-ramp. There are improvements, as you would expect, in the technology. The vehicles that we'll get this summer are probably going to do about 175 from what we're understanding. In other words, you could count on that. So that would increase the level. But I don't see in any near future it becoming a 1-for-1 replacement. So that would be something that us and every transit agency will have to deal with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, few questions here. These are the 3 recommendations that staff is bringing forward. Were there other alternatives that were considered and rejected as part of the process of identifying these recommendations?
I'm Mike Thompson, Deputy CFO. We always look at our capital program and see if there's any, because we do know we have flexible dollars there, but it's all being used for state repair. It's not fully funded. So it's very difficult to just shift money out of capital without taking something off the tables. We can shift money from capital. We can do state repair, but we can't shift money from capital, do state repair, and do ZEBs. There's just not enough money to go around. So we looked at all of our capital program and our capital needs as a way of looking at those flexible dollars. We always try to maximize the other operating revenue opportunities and advertising and digital kiosks and the big board in downtown, those type of things we've always looking going forward, but there aren't many big numbers out there that we can attack really.
Yeah, and we are bringing forward, we're working with our concessionaire to get some more funding opportunities around billboards, digital boards. So we'll bring that back to the board. But again, you're not looking more than $1 million a year type of thing. We wouldn't suggest reopening any CBAs to reduce. We just approved CBAs for a lot of our workforce, but we need that in order to actually get bodies in the seat to operate. And then, we haven't cutting management staff. We wouldn't contemplate that right off the bat. It wouldn't be a significant number. Does anybody know total personnel costs for management?
It's about $40 million a year.
Yeah, but that's everybody.
Yeah, that's everybody.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly you could direct us to look at those kinds of cuts as well. And we could bring that back. We'll still need some of these bigger things in order to immediately save us some money moving forward. So.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Let's go back to Director Elo Rivera.
Thank you, Chair. What is the variable that could have the biggest impact in a positive way, recognizing that there's a structural deficit, but what variables are looming out there, if any, that could impact some of the tougher decisions that we need to make in a positive way?
The ballot measure and potential sales.
Anything in this, like the state budget?
Yeah, I mean, if they would expand the SB 125 program, the state could add, for instance, $2 billion to that. That would add to, I'm trying to think how much it was the last time. It was $4.5 billion, I believe, SB 125 originally. So that could give us a little bit of leeway as well.
And if that were to happen, what would change, if anything, in terms of what's in front of us?
Well, for instance, what we could do, because every year that we ask for a waiver from the ICT, we have to bring it back to the board each year.
Yeah.
So for instance, if money did start to flow again, we could then say, all right, we're not going to ask for the waiver this year. Instead, we'll move forward with the purchase as included in the ICT.
Is that the thing that you would bring? And let me explain where I'm going with this. I think one of the things that I'm trying to understand is the recommendations based on what's in front of us today, projecting with the numbers that are in front of us today, and there could be fluidity to that in both directions.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand what starts to get turned back on first. Like, do all of these cuts need to be taken together? The sequencing of the cuts and of what would be restored, I think, is important to me. And I think that's important to the community as well in terms of understanding expectations. What are the easiest switches to flip on and off? Is it service? Is it the capital improvement program? I'm just trying to get some understanding of what life looks like if we do this, but things start to trend in one direction or another.
Well, and that certainly would be something we would bring back to the board for their input. But right now, I mean, if I look at the service we're considering cutting is planned service. It's not implemented yet. And so that dovetails with the lower cost of purchasing buses as well. That's in the capital cuts. So those two would be married together. And that would be certainly a discussion if we were to gain, for instance, more SB 125 money than already anticipated. And then going forward with with CTAC, we have money in the CIPs from previous years that we're not getting rid of because we're purchasing properties. We're not getting rid of the project itself. This is delaying that. Mm-hmm. So we will need future monies for that. If grants start to flow again for that type of project, we'll want to go after that. I wish I could give you more certainty about what we would do, but not knowing what our potential sources of new revenue are, it's hard to really tell you what would go first.
So I guess that kind of, is it general fund revenue or is it restricted? And if it's restricted, what's it restricted for? Totally understand. You can't predict all of that. I think I understand why that's very challenging to do. But I think from my perspective, I'll stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Let me ask a couple of questions. It has been mentioned that if the ICT were to be paused, the program would have to be resumed because it would only be temporary. How long of a pause would that be?
I actually think that the pause we're talking about is specific to 3 fiscal years. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mike
Meaning
Wygant.
credits for 2 years and then a potential ask for a waiver in the 3rd year.
Correct. So we had this year with the funding that we have 2 vehicle replacements that we still need to place the order, and they're under the current ICT for 25% of those vehicle purchases for 40 or 35. We don't have any 35-foot buses. It doesn't actually apply to the 60 or any cutaway vehicles. That'll change next year. So the first order of business, if you go down this path, would be use your credits so that you can continue to buy for state of good repair the vehicles to get you through these next 2 purchases of this year. Then you would need a waiver for 2026 calendar year for the next purchase, which I think is on the ZEB side, it would be 32 vehicles. So we'll have some credits still left over, but not 32. So at that point, depending on service levels, you would decide, we would need your permission to go to the CARB for a 1-year exemption and choose to either forego any zero emission vehicles or to replace what was originally in our plan with zero emission with CNG to maintain that service level. You would need vehicles to do that.
And I think that the whole purpose of the waiver in the ICT is that they recognize that if you cut transit service in order to pay for the buses, then you are actually causing increases in emissions. So, and the other thing that is true is that the CNG buses we are purchasing now are cleaner than the ones that we'll be replacing.
Yeah, both of those are correct. Yes, the intent of the ICT and the off-ramps were not to force transit agencies into reducing service to pay for this, because the fact of the matter is our customers would be forced into driving vehicles or not get to where they need to go. That wouldn't have an economic advantage for them, nor would it have a climate advantage. So that is correct. And yes, part of that was the consideration that you would be replacing CNG vehicles that are older at the end of their useful life and higher emission standards from original compared to what now are the near zero engines. So yeah, there'd be a huge advantage to that.
And I understand that argument. I mean, the argument being if we don't do this and end up having to cut service to address the deficit, then that's fewer people using the service, more vehicles on the road, ends up being counterproductive. Okay, we've got 3 recommendations here. How do those 3 recommendations break out in terms of the estimated savings? Can you break that out a little bit as to what we are looking at for each one of those?
Well, the first, the second recommendation is to really dependent on the first. We were hoping to delay some of the zero emission bus stuff, and this is savings on bus costs, but also saving on delaying some of those infrastructure projects for a few years as well. Excuse me. We would complete the KMD first phase. We would complete the IAD first phase. We would already completed South Bay's first phase of electric charging infrastructure. We would just delay any future ones. Since we can delay bus purchases, we can delay some of that infrastructure costs. So those sort of intertwined. I mean, if we wanted to shift from capital with leaving ICT in place, it would be much more difficult, and we would have to impact state of good repair, which we're trying not to do. And then the third one's sort of standalone. It's a much smaller impact because it's only $3 million in FY26, and then it grows to, is it $22 million a year on service on bus? 20 million total.
Yeah, it's $3 million a year that we'd be saving on the trolley side, and then $9 million a year on or $11 million per year on the bus side.
So the capital is a much bigger impact, but it's dependent on ICT.
Okay.
But a total for service, if we don't put that service in, we're anticipating 20 million in savings. Is that what I just heard?
It's 31 total.
22 plus 9, yeah, 31.
Okay. Thank you for those answers. Nobody has made a motion, and I suspect that's because nobody wants to do any of this, which I fully understand, and I share that sentiment. At the same time, I think that the alternatives if we don't start getting serious about the structural budget deficit and start planning for that and start looking at how we approach that. I think those alternatives are worse. And I think they're worse for every interest that is involved here. And I do not want to go down that road. And I also recognize that if the situation turns around in our favor, that we can quickly pivot on some of these. We saw that with the state funding. We made some significant cuts that nobody wanted to make, but then when that state funding got freed up, we restored some of those anticipated cuts. So I think the prudent thing to do is to move forward with this, as distasteful as it is. So I'm going to go ahead and make a motion to adopt the staff recommendation, and we'll see if there's a second out there. Okay. Okay, thank you. We have a motion that I made. We have a second from Director Elo Rivera. Is there any further discussion on the motion? All right, seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Please make your selections. Chair, the motion passes with 6 members voting yes and 1 member absent.
Okay, thank you very much, clerk. Thank you for the discussion on that.
And if I could just say, I will take your comments. We will look at our presentation because I feel like there's pieces that we could add in there that will make it easier for the board to understand.
Very good. All right, item 8 is the review of the draft agenda for next week's board meeting. Any questions on the draft agenda? Let me go over here. Chair Pro Tem Montgomery Stepp.
Chair, just a quick question in this for Sharon or Karen. There is on the consent, there's the policy number 6, disadvantaged business enterprise program policy revisions on the consent for an actual policy change. And then there's an info item on the agenda for discussion. Just one, and I know Councilmember Foster had brought this up in the board meeting last time. It seems to me the policy discussion is equally as important, right? I'd like for a discussion item. Is there a way to consolidate those, or is there a reason why they're broken up like this?
So we absolutely could consolidate them, but the policy changes are simply to make changes to reflect changes in federal law. So like just more technical updates to the policy that are necessary to like stay current. So there wasn't anything significantly substantive that changed how we do our policy. It was just items that needed to be documented, in that policy document.
Yeah, we might as well consolidate.
I was just going to say, I think I wouldn't want it to come up for you all in the meeting. I think maybe just consolidate those.
Okay.
I'm
Absolutely.
thinking, okay, thank you. Do I need to move anything if that's?
No, we can take that in staff direction.
Yeah, we'll just do it. Okay, thank you for that. Any staff or committee member communications before we adjourn? All right, the executive committee's next meeting date will be on March 6th at 9 o'clock in the morning. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.